Chapter 1. A long, long time ago there were many unknown places, and in those unknown places there were many unknown people. A fireball hung in the distance in the wilderness at dusk. The red light it emitted was like a huge flame, spreading slowly and steadily. The newly grown moss after the snow on the wilderness melted, spreading everywhere like a burned scar. It was quiet all around. Only the cries of eagles and the jumping of gazelles could be heard occasionally. 3 people appeared in the empty wilderness. They gathered under a small tree, which was rare in the wilderness. They did not greet each other, but bowed their heads at the same time, as if there was something very interesting under the tree that was worth studying and thinking about. 2 colonies of ants were surrounding the light brown tree root, which was exposed on the cold soil. Perhaps it was because it was difficult to find another perfect home like the tree root in this wasteland, so the battle was particularly fierce. After a while there were thousands of ant corpses left. It seemed to be a bloody and tragic scene, but in fact it was just a small black dot. The weather was still very cold, but the 3 people under the tree were not wearing much clothes. They did not seem to be afraid of the cold. They just watched attentively for a long time. Suddenly, one of them said in a low voice, "What is the great way of the ant kingdom in the secular world?" The person who spoke had innocent eyes and a thin figure. He was still a young man, wearing a white, thin shirt without a collar. He carried a thin wooden sword without a scabbard on his back. His black hair was finely combed into a bun, with a wooden fork in it. The fork looked like it could fall at any time, but it was as unshakable as a pine tree growing on a mountain. When the chief monk was preaching, I saw countless flying ants bathing in the light. The person who said this was a young monk. He was wearing a tattered kapok kasaya, and the new stubble on his head was black and sharp. It was as sure and determined as his face and the way he spoke. The wooden sword youth shook his head and said, "Ants that can fly will eventually fall. They will never touch the sky. If you insist on thinking like this, then you will never understand what Taoist heart is." The young monk closed his eyes slightly and looked at the ants that were scattering their limbs at his feet. He said, "I heard that your abbey dean recently accepted a child with the surname Chan. You should understand that a place like Jisho Abbey will never have only one genius like you." The young man with the wooden sword raised his eyebrows and replied sarcastically, "I don't understand why a guy like you, who can't be restrained, is qualified to travel the world on behalf of Xiankong Temple." The young monk did not respond to his provocation. Looking at the ants scurrying anxiously at his feet, he said, "Ants can fly and fall, but they're better at climbing. They're good at building a foundation for their companions, and are not afraid of sacrificing themselves. If the ants pile up one by one, as long as there's enough of them, they'll definitely be able to pile up into a pile that can touch the sky." A sharp cry of an eagle came from the twilight sky, sounding panicked and terrified. It was unclear whether it was afraid of the 3 strange people under the tree, or afraid of the non-existent giant pile of ants soaring into the sky, or something else. "I'm scared," the young man with the wooden sword on his back suddenly said, his thin shoulders shrinking. The young monk nodded in agreement, although the expression on his face was still calm and determined. The 3rd young man under the small tree had a strong body, wrapped in clothes that looked like animal skin. His bare legs were as hard as stone, and under his rough skin, one could clearly see his muscles that contained infinite explosive power. He remained silent and did not say a word, but the little spots on his skin still revealed his true feelings at the moment. The 3 young men under the tree came from the 3 most mysterious places in the world. They were ordered by their masters to travel the world, and they were as dazzling as 3 stars that traversed the world. But even they felt an irresistible fear in this wilderness today. The eagle was not afraid of ants, for in its eyes, ants were just black spots. The ants were not afraid of the eagle, for they were not even qualified to be food for the eagle. In their world there was no such powerful creature as the eagle, and they could not see or touch it. However, over the course of thousands of years, it was believed that there would always be a few maverick ants in the ant colony who, for some mysterious reason, decided to temporarily look away from the rotten leaves and shells to the azure sky. Then their world would be different, because they saw they were afraid. The 3 young men under the tree raised their heads and looked at a shallow trench on the ground dozens of meters away. The shallow trench was naturally not deep, and there was nothing but black in it. It was particularly clear on the mottled surface of the wilderness. This trench had suddenly appeared 2 hours ago and reached the sky as soon as it appeared, as if it had been chopped out by an invisible ghost with a mountainous axe, or drawn by a divine craftsman with a rafter. It was chilling, incomprehensible, and frightening. The young man with the wooden sword on his back stared at the black line and said, "I always thought that the motionless Yama was a legend. It is said that the Yama had 70,000 children. Perhaps this one is just a stray in the human world. A legend is a legend." The young man with the wooden sword on his back said expressionlessly, "It is also said that a sage will appear every 1,000 years. But who has really seen a sage in these thousands of years? If you really don't believe it, why don't you dare to step over that black line?" No one dared to step over that black line, that shallow trench, not even the proud and powerful young men. Ants could crawl over it, long-limbed insects could jump over it, gazelles could leap over it, eagles could fly over it, but humans could not. It was precisely because they were humans that they did not dare to step over it. The young man with the wooden sword on his back raised his head to look at the sky and asked, "If that child really exists, then where is he?" By this time, more than half of the setting sun had sunk into the ground, and the darkness of the night was surging in from all directions. The temperature in the wilderness dropped sharply, and a frightening atmosphere began to envelop the entire world. Night has fallen and he is everywhere. Where can you find him? The young man in animal skin broke the silence that had been there for a long time. His voice was deep and rough, unbefitting of his age. It buzzed and vibrated like the incessant rolling of a river, or like the incessant grinding of a rusty sword against a hard rock. After saying this, he left in a special way. Several flames suddenly burst out from his 2 hard and thick bare legs, covering the lower part of the young man's body in a crimson fire. The roaring wind made the gravel on the ground roll rapidly. Then, as if an invisible force had grabbed his neck, his body was lifted more than 100 feet into the sky, and then he fell down with a whistling sound, smashing hard on the ground. Then he jumped up again, like a stone jumping irregularly into the distance. It looked extremely clumsy, but extremely fast. I only know that his surname is Tang, but I don't know what his full name is. The young man with the wooden sword on his back said thoughtfully, "If we met at another time and place, only one of us could survive. His disciple is so powerful. How powerful is his master? I heard that his master has been practicing the 23-year cicada cultivation these years. I wonder if he will carry a heavy shell when he breaks through." It was quiet around him, and no one answered. He looked back in confusion. He saw that the young monk's eyes were closed, and his eyelids were trembling rapidly. It seemed that he was thinking about something troubling. In fact, since the young man in animal skin said those words about the dark night, the young monk had been trapped in this strange state. Sensing the gaze, the young monk slowly opened his eyes and grinned. The original determination and calmness in his smile had already turned into benevolence out of nowhere. His parted lips were a bloody mess, and it was his tongue that had been chewed up. The young man with the wooden sword frowned. The young monk slowly took off the prayer beads on his wrist and solemnly hung them around his neck. Then he started to walk away. His steps were heavy and steady, and seemed to be extremely slow. But in the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared into the distance. There was no one else under the tree. All the emotions on the young man's face had faded away, leaving only absolute calmness, or absolute indifference. He looked at the shadow in the dust in the north, which kept jumping up and down like a stone, and shouted in a low voice, "Devil." He looked at the back of the young monk in the west, who was walking silently with his head down, and said, "Heretic. Insignificant. Devil and heretic are insignificant." After saying this, the thin wooden sword on the young man's back vibrated and made a strange buzzing sound. With a swoosh, it rose into the air and turned into a stream of light, cutting the small tree in the wilderness into 53,333 pieces. The branches and trunks were all turned into powder, and the powder fell on the ants who had forgotten about life and death. The mute opens his mouth to speak. "Put some salt on the cake." The young man sang and walked toward the east. The thin wooden sword floated in the air a few meters behind him and followed him silently. In the first year of the Tianqi era of the Tang Empire, There was a strange phenomenon in the wilderness. All the world wayfarers gathered there. Since then, Qin Yan, the successor of the Xiankong Temple, had practiced the vow of silence and no longer spoke. Tang, the successor of the Devil's Doctrine, hid in the desert and disappeared. Yisu, the successor of the Jishou Abbey, broke through the Hermetic training and traveled around all the countries. The three of them had their own gains. However, the three of them did not know that on that day, when night was about to fall, at the other end of the black ravine that they did not dare to cross, near the direction of the capital city, there sat a scholar wearing straw sandals and a tattered coat. The scholar did not seem to feel the power and sternness represented by the black ravine. He held a scroll in his left hand and a wooden dipper in his right. When he had nothing to do, he would rest when he was tired, and drink water when he was thirsty. He was covered in dust, but his face was peaceful. It was not until the three of them had left and the shallow black ravine on the wilderness was gradually flattened by the wind and sand that the scholar stood up. He dusted himself off, tied the wooden dipper to his waist, and carefully hid the scroll in his coat. He took one last look in the direction of the capital before leaving. There was a long alley in the capital of Chang, and on the east side was the residence of the official of council, and on the west side was the residence of the Xianwei general. Although they were not the most powerful nobility, they had great prestige. Usually the alley was quiet, but today it was long gone. There was a new child in the official of council's residence. The midwives were busy going in and out. However, from the master to the maids, the joy on everyone's faces seemed to be mixed with some other emotions. No one dared to laugh out loud. The maids who hurried past the corner with water basins in their arms occasionally heard the sounds coming from outside the wall, and their faces showed even more fear. The Xianwei general Lin Guangyan, who was known for his bravery, was no longer brave because he offended the bravest general of the empire, Xiahou. He was accused of colluding with the enemy country, and after months of interrogation by the prince, there was finally a result. The result was clear, and the punishment was simple: the execution of the whole family. The door of the official of council's residence was tightly shut. The housekeeper leaned against the crack of the door and looked at the general's residence, which was also tightly shut. He could not help but tremble when he heard the sound of heavy objects chopping into pieces of meat, and the sound of watermelons rolling on the ground. The two families had lived in the same alley for many years, and he was familiar with everyone in the general's residence, from the housekeeper to the doorman. Listening to the horrible sounds, he seemed to see countless sharp pedaos cutting open the necks of familiar people, and the heads with familiar faces rolling on the blue stone slabs and hitting the door, gradually piling up into a small hill. Blood flowed from the door of the general's residence. It was dark and sticky like glutinous rice slurry mixed with cinnabar, and there were some tendons that looked like purple potatoes. The housekeeper stared at it with a pale face, and could no longer control his emotions. He leaned against the door and began to vomit. Suddenly, there came the hurried sound of horse hooves scolding, and then the sound of rough knocks. He could vaguely hear curses, as if someone in the general's residence had escaped. A family general of the prince's residence rode on a horse and shouted, "Not a single one is missing." There were a few scratches and bloodstains on the wall in the garden behind the official of council's residence. "Young master, listen to me. You can't go out. Let Chu go, let him go." In a woodshed not far from here, a housekeeper of the general's residence was covered in blood. He looked at two boys of 4 or 5 years old in front of him, and his dry lips moved slightly. His voice was extremely hoarse, and his wrinkled face was full of despair and struggle. He struggled until tears came out of the corners of his eyes. It did not take long for the Yulin royal guards to break into the official of council's residence to find this woodshed. Seeing the two corpses in the woodshed, the captain reported loudly after an examination, "Not a single one is missing. Not a single one is missing." The simplest way to interpret the words "unworldly sublime being" was that sublime beings usually lived outside the mortal world, and those who lived outside the mortal world could easily be sublime beings. There was actually some truth hidden in this nonsense. What they feared was something mortals could not touch, and what they were happy about was something mortals could not understand. Therefore, the mortal world did not know what happened outside the mortal world, and the people outside the mortal world would not care about the scenes of life and death, or the joy of new life that were happening in the mortal world. They would not care about the butcher's scale losing weight, the drunkard's cellar being eaten by rats, the Xianwei general of the imperial court dying, or a civil official giving birth to a daughter. The joys and sorrows of the two worlds were never connected. If they could be connected, they would be sages. There was a high mountain on the outskirts of the capital Chang, and half of the mountain peak was hidden in the clouds, and a figure was slowly climbing between the cliffs to the west of the back mountain. The man's back was extremely tall, and he wore a black overcoat over his unlined shirt. He was carrying a food box in his hand. Swaying against the wind, he walked to a cave and sat down. He opened the food box, took out his chopsticks, picked up a piece of ginger and put it into his mouth, chewed it carefully, and picked up 2 pieces of mutton. He sighed with satisfaction and praised. Under the setting sun, the capital Chang, and was gradually shrouded in darkness. Dark clouds of rain were faintly floating in the distance. The tall man looked at somewhere in the capital and said with emotion, "I seem to see you in the past." Then he looked up at the sky, holding the chopsticks in his right hand, and said, "As for you, what's the use no matter how high you fly?" Obviously, the 2 sentences were meant for 2 different people. After a moment of silence, the tall man picked up the rice wine beside him and drank it in one gulp. He raised the empty bowl and looked around the capital, saying respectfully, "The wind rises, the rain falls, and the night is coming." When he said that, a gust of wind came from outside the mountain, causing his clothes to flutter. The old trees between the rocks shook violently, and the mountain rocks fell. When he said the word rain falls, the rain clouds that floated above the capital city suddenly darkened. Countless drops of rain turned into a pillar and poured down in the last of the twilight. When he finished speaking, the night sky just happened to occupy half of the vault of heaven, and the darkness was like the eyes of the Lord of Hades. The tall man put down the bowl and angrily muttered, "It's so damn dark." Chapter 2. In the spring of the 13th year of the Tianqi era of the Tang Empire, it rained in the city of Wei. This military border city was located at the northwest end of the vast territory of the Tang Empire. In order to prevent the barbarians from the grassland from invading, the 4 earthen walls were built very thick, looking like a solid earthen enclosure. In the dry season, the dust on the earthen walls would be blown away by the northwest wind, and then fall on the simple barracks and the soldiers. The whole world would be covered with earthen yellow dust. When people shook their bedding at night, it would cause a sandstorm. During the spring drought, the rain came at the right time, and was warmly welcomed by the soldiers. Since last night, the rain had washed away the dust on the roofs, and seemed to have brightened people's eyes. At least Ma Shixiang's eyes were very bright at this time. As the highest military officer in the city of Wei, he was very humble at this time. Although he was a little dissatisfied with the yellow muddy footprints on the expensive carpet, he managed to cover up his dissatisfaction into a trace of surprise. He bowed respectfully to the old man in a dirty robe beside the short table, and asked in a low voice, "Dear boss, is there anything else that the noble in the tent needs? If the noble insists on leaving tomorrow, I can send a team of 100 guards to accompany her at any time. I will make a record and send it to the military ministry immediately." The old man smiled gently, pointed at the figures in the tent, and shook his head to show that he had no objection. At this moment, a cold and proud woman's voice came from the tent, "No need. Just mind your own business." This morning, after the caravan rushed into the city of Wei in the rain, it did not take Ma Shixiang long to guess the identity of the noble in the caravan. Therefore, he did not have any objection to the arrogant indifference of the other party. The person in the tent was silent for a moment, and suddenly said, "From the city of Wei to the capital, the road around the Min Mountain is difficult to travel. It seems that the rain will continue for some time, and maybe some mountain roads will be washed away. Find me a guide from the army." Ma Shixiang was startled and thought of a hateful guy. After a moment of silence, he lowered his head and replied, "There is a ready-made candidate." Outside the barracks, the lieutenants looked at each other with different expressions on their faces. Some were regretful, some were reluctant, some were glad, and some were shocked. However, it was obvious that none of them had expected Ma Shixiang to choose that person to be the noble's guide. "General, are you really going to let him go just like that?" a lieutenant asked in surprise. The city of Wei was not big, and there were no more than 300 soldiers and officers. The military camp was far away from the bustling area, and sometimes it was more like a bandit's den. The so-called general was just a deputy general of the lowest rank. However, Ma Shixiang was very strict in managing his army, or in other words, the leader of the Wei gang liked to be called general. Therefore, his subordinates didn't dare to forget to add the word general in their daily conversations. Ma Shixiang wiped the rainwater off his face and looked at the yellow-brown puddles around the barracks. He sighed and said, "We can't keep him in this desolate place forever. The recommendation letter has been here for almost half a year, and he has a bright future ahead of him. Anyway, he's going to the capital for the academy's preliminary examination, and it's just in the same direction as that noble's team. Let's do him a favor." "I don't think that noble will appreciate it," the lieutenant answered angrily. The door of the barracks behind them was pushed open, and a pretty maidservant walked out. She looked at Ma Shixiang and the lieutenants and said coldly, "Take me to see that guide." As the personal maidservant of the noble, she didn't hide her slight arrogance in front of the frontier generals of the imperial court. The gatekeeper of the prime minister, the personal maidservant of the noble, and the guest of the prince were all troublesome roles in the officialdom. They were the most troublesome ones in the officialdom. Ma Shixiang really didn't want to deal with these kinds of people. After a few casual words, he waved his hand to summon a lieutenant and ordered him to take the maidservant of the noble to find the guide. The rain had stopped for a while, and the city of Wei looked especially fresh after the light rain. Along the road, there were a few willows blooming with spring green. However, although the scenery was good, the city was too small. After a few steps, the captain led the maidservant to their destination, which was a simple but lively barracks. Hearing the noise, curses, and orders coming from the door, the maidservant slightly frowned, thinking that someone dared to drink in the military camp in broad daylight. The curtain was blown up by the wind, and the sound inside suddenly became clear. It was indeed a finger-guessing game, but not a proper drinking game. Hearing the order, the maidservant's pretty face flushed with shame and anger, and she secretly clenched her fists in her sleeves. "Let's play the lecherous finger-guessing game. Who is lecherous? You are lecherous. Who is lecherous? I am lecherous. Who is lecherous? He is lecherous." The dirty orders came back and forth, and the noise was endless. After a long time there was no winner. The maidservant, who looked more and more annoyed, lifted a corner of the curtain and looked inside with an extremely unfriendly look. At first glance she saw a young man at the square table. The young man was about 15 or 16 years old, wearing a standard cotton shirt commonly seen in the army. The front of the cotton shirt was full of oil stains, and his black hair was a little curly and oily, either naturally or because he had not washed it for several years. But his face was very clean, so his eyebrows and eyes were particularly clear, and so were the freckles on his cheeks. "Who is lecherous? You are lecherous." Contrary to the dirty finger-guessing game, the young man's expression was particularly focused and serious. Not only was there not the slightest hint of lechery, but even his eyebrows revealed a bit of holiness and loftiness. His right hand kept making rock-paper-scissors gestures in front of him. His fists were like the wind, and his knives were full of killing intent. It seemed that winning or losing this finger-guessing game was more important than his own life. A few green-headed flies that had survived in the harsh environment of the Northwest and possessed strong vitality were trying to land on the front of the young man's cotton shirt that was stained with oil, but they were always driven away by the wind generated by his fists. "I won." The long finger-guessing game, which seemed to squeeze all the air out of the lungs of the two people at the table, finally came to an end. The black-haired young man waved his right arm hard, announcing his victory. He smiled very happily, and a lovely dimple appeared on his left cheek. The young man's opponent refused to admit defeat, insisting that the young man changed his game when he called who was lecherous, so the room suddenly fell into a fierce quarrel. The soldiers watching the game on the side all had their own sides, and no one could convince the other. At this moment someone shouted, "As usual, listen to Sang Sang." Everyone turned to look at the corner of the room. There, a girl around 11 or 12 years old was moving a bucket of water. She was short and skinny, with dark skin and ordinary eyes. The maid uniform on her body, which her master had stolen from somewhere, was obviously a little too loose. The hem kept dragging on the ground. It was obvious that it was very strenuous for her to move a bucket that might be even heavier than her. The little handmaiden named Sang Sang put down the bucket and turned around. The soldiers looked at her nervously, like the rich guests in the casino waiting for the dealer to open the final big or small, and it was obvious that this was not the first time such a scene had happened. The little handmaiden frowned and glanced at the young man, and then looked at the indignant soldier across the table. She said seriously, "In the 23rd round you used scissors and he used fists. But you said he was lecherous, so you had already lost at that time." There was a roar of laughter in the room, and the crowd dispersed. The soldier cursed as he handed over the money. The young man happily took the money, wiped his hand on the grease stains on his chest, and then patted the soldier on the shoulder to express his sincere consolation. "Don't think too much. In the whole city of Wei. No, in the whole world, who can beat me, Ning Kai?" The maidservant's face was very ugly, and so did the captain who had been standing beside and secretly watching her. He grabbed the curtain with his hand and took a deep breath. When he was about to cough, he was stopped by the fierce eyes of the maidservant. In order to stop the captain from disturbing the young man, the maidservant followed the young man and the maidservant out of the barracks. Along the way, she observed them silently. The captain did not know what she wanted to do, and had to think that she was a cautious and weird person who was close to a noble. Along the way, the teenager named Ning Kai did not show anything special. He bought some food and greeted the fat auntie in the tavern by the street. He seemed to be very relaxed. The only thing that made the maidservant feel strange and made her face turn uglier and uglier was that the skinny maidservant was struggling to drag the bucket behind him, but the teenager did not have the slightest intention of helping. The empire was a country with a strict social class, but the people were simple. Even in the gloomy and flashy capital Chang, and even the most indifferent nobleman could not watch a weak girl of 11 or 12 years old struggle so hard without being moved. Soldiers are allowed to keep maidservants in the army? The pretty maidservant suppressed her anger and asked the captain beside her. The captain scratched his head and answered, "A few years ago, there was a great drought in Hebei province. Countless refugees rushed to the south and the border counties. There were dead people everywhere. I heard that Sang Sang was picked up by Ning Kai from the dead bodies. Ning Kai was also an orphan. Since then they have been relying on each other. Later, he signed up for the army, and the only condition was to bring this little girl into the city of Wei." He glanced at the maidservant and carefully explained, "We all know that this kind of thing is not allowed in the army, but their situation is a little special. We can't force a little girl into a dead end, so we don't see it." Hearing this explanation, the maidservant's face became a little better. However, when she saw Ning Kai holding half a roast chicken and the little handmaiden dragging the bucket a few meters behind him, her mood became bad again. She said coldly, "This is not relying on each other. He obviously wants that girl's life." The city of Wei was indeed very small. Soon, the four of them came to a house in the south. There was a small stone platform outside the house, surrounded by a simple fence. The maidservant and the captain stood outside the fence and looked in. The little handmaiden moved the bucket, which was half her height, to the side of the water tank with difficulty. Then she stood on the stool next to the tank and poured the water into the tank with all her strength. Then she began to wash the rice and vegetables. While she was steaming the rice, she took a rag and began to wipe the tables, chairs, and doors. Not long after, a mist rose and shrouded her thin body. Although it had rained last night, the rain was not heavy enough. The dirt on the doors and windows had not been washed away. Instead, it had turned into ugly muddy water stains. These muddy water stains were quickly removed by the little handmaiden's wiping cloth. The small courtyard of the house suddenly became clean and bright. Obviously, she did these housework every day, and she seemed to be very skilled and fast. The little black handmaiden, who was still a child, was as busy as an ant, running around like a servant. She was so tired that she was sweating and her face was red, which looked a little funny and pitiful. The guy named Ning Kei obviously lacked these two emotions. He was lying on a bamboo chair quietly or comfortably, with an old book in his left hand and a hard branch in his right hand. Occasionally, when he was lost in thought, he threw the branch in his hand casually and stretched out his palm to the air. After a while, a pot of hot tea was put on his palm. The soldiers in the city of Wei had long been used to the daily life in this small courtyard, so they did not feel strange. But the eyes of the noble maidservant standing outside the fence gradually became cold. Especially when she saw the little handmaiden was busy cooking and cleaning, she dared not forget to pay attention to the request of the young soldier and was ready to make tea, pour water, and massage his back and legs at any time. The frost on her face became heavier, as if it was about to freeze. Chapter 3. It's okay if she's your handmaiden, but didn't you pick her up from a pile of dead bodies? Didn't you say that you two depended on each other? Even if we take 10,000 steps back and say that she is your maidservant, don't you think that she is still too young to bear such heavy and arduous labor? Why is this young lad so lazy? Why can't he do it himself? Perhaps it triggered some bad childhood memories, or perhaps it was because her imagination of some beautiful feelings had been completely destroyed by Ning Quebec. The maidservant pushed open the fence and walked in. Her eyes fell on the bamboo chair and the old book that the lad had been reading seriously. She said with slight sarcasm, "I thought you'd read some great works of sages that could make you forget everything that happened around you. I didn't expect that it's just the article on the response of the Tao that can be bought anywhere in the market. Do people like you also have extravagant hopes to step into the path of cultivation?" Ning Kei sat up and looked curiously at the well-dressed young lady who should never have appeared in the city of Wei. Then he looked at the awkward captain and explained after a short pause, "I could only buy this one, so I had to make do with it. I'm just curious. I don't have any extravagant hopes." The maidservant obviously didn't expect that the lad would answer so naturally and casually, which made her stunned. Then she looked at the little handmaiden who was pouring ashes from the stove by the door and said unhappily, "How can there be a man like you in the Tang Empire?" Ning Kei frowned in confusion and followed the man's gaze to Sang Sang, who was standing by the window with a rag in her hand. He understood where the sharpness of the man's words came from. A dimple appeared on his left cheek, and he said with a smile, "It seems that you are older than me. How about, you take me as a boy instead of a man?" The maidservant had probably never seen such a shameless person in her life. Her fists slowly clenched in her sleeves and her expression was cold. Just as she was about to explode, her gaze fell on the muddy ground next to the bamboo chair, and the words drawn on the tree branches. She couldn't help but have a thought, and a strange look appeared in her eyes, causing her to forget what she wanted to say. In the best barracks in the city of Wei, the old man in a shabby robe was resting with his eyes closed. Border General Ma Shixiang was half bowing and talking to the noble in the tent. His humble attitude couldn't hide his surprise. "You're not satisfied with the guide?" he asked confusedly. "Why?" The voice of the noblewoman in the tent was extremely dissatisfied. She reprimanded, "What I want is a smart and capable guide. Not a lazy young man whose head is filled with dreams of cultivation, and who has no strength to even truss a chicken." Ma Shixiang coughed slightly and explained in a low voice, "As I know, Ning Kei is still young, but he has beheaded many barbarians in the grassland in the past 2 years. If it is just two of a few chickens, I think it shouldn't be a problem." The cold voice behind the tent paused for a moment and said unhappily, "Can killing people make a good guide?" Ma Shixiang answered more humbly, "Ning Kei is definitely not the one who killed the most enemies among the 300 soldiers in the city of Wei. But I can guarantee with my head that no matter how fierce the battlefield is, this lad will definitely be one of the survivors." Then he raised his head and said with a smile, "Because of his accumulated military achievements, he has received a letter of recommendation from the military ministry. This lad has really worked hard and passed the preliminary examination half a year ago. This time, he will report to the academy after returning to the capital." Hearing the word academy, the noble in the tent suddenly became silent and did not speak again. After Ma Shixiang left, The old man in the shabby robe slowly opened his eyes. There was a rare trace of interest in his old and calm eyes. He looked at the curtain and said with a gentle smile, "It is really surprising that a soldier in this small border town can enter the academy. In this case, the lad must be the best in both character and ability. It is not bad to let him be a guide. It has only been a year since I left the country. I did not expect that a sacred place like the academy would start to recruit ruffians." His tone was still cold and disdainful, but his actual attitude had changed. At least the noble no longer objected to Ninkei being the guide of his team. Only a name was needed to change the mind of a bigwig. That place called the academy must be very complicated. The old man spoke of another matter with a puzzled expression. "Previously, I went to see the words he wrote on the muddy ground." He copied the third section of the article on the response of the Tao. The lines of the words were concise but extremely vivid. Even though he only used a branch, when it fell on the wetland, it felt like the edge of a knife in the mud. This soldier named Ninkei's calligraphy has entered the right path. I really don't know how he practiced it and who his teacher is. That soldier is just an empty brush stroke. When I saw it by chance, I was shocked because of the novelty. Now that I think about it carefully, it is just a strange way of writing. It is not the right path. In the future, he will probably be a calligrapher outside the fragrance workshop in the capital." The noble replied coldly. The old man shook his head and said, "The word novelty is the key. I don't know calligraphy, but when I looked at the place where the soldier's branch fell, I could vaguely see the meaning of gold and stone. It is rare to see this kind of character." It is really similar to the skills of the talisman Taoism masters in the Taoist altar. "You mean the divine talisman?" The noble behind the tent was startled and immediately sneered. "There are hundreds of millions of people in the world, but there are only a dozen talisman Taoism masters. Those sublime people either hide in the palace or sit quietly in the temple. They meditate and cultivate their whole lives to condense the chi of heaven and earth between the golden hook and the silver stroke. That lad has no aura at all. He is just an ordinary person. Even if he reads the article on the response of the Tao for another 50 years, I am afraid he can't even step into the initial state. How dare he discuss with those masters?" The old man smiled and said nothing more. Although he was a cultivator and was respected by the noble along the way, the difference in status between them was too big. The so-called respect was actually because he cherished the old and cherished the talented. Since that was the case, it was better not to say things that should not be said. Of course, he did not agree with the words of the noble behind the tent. Regarding the soldier named Ninkei, the old man had his own judgment. In the secular world, there were only a few mortals who could sense the chi of heaven and earth and step into the initial state. The initial stage of sensing was the most difficult and definitely not an easy task. However, if Ninkei could really enter the academy to study, he might be able to reach the legendary second floor one day and embark on the path of cultivation. His strange yet powerful calligraphy would definitely be of great help to him. Even if he could never be enlightened, his calligraphy alone would be able to make the sublime people in the academy and the Taoist altar look at him differently. At the very least, it would be able to shock those scholars and calligraphers. Ninkei put down the book in his hand and shook his head as he walked out of the door. There was a faint sense of loss and unwillingness on his face. This was the article on the response of the Tao that he bought with the grain transport team to the market in Kaiping when he was young. As the noble maidservant had said, it was a common book that could be found everywhere. He knew this very well, but he still did not forget to read and study it, as if this book was the legendary 7 volumes of tomes of arcane enshrined in the unknown place of Haotian Taoism. The pages of the book had long been flipped and the corners were curled up, looking extremely shabby. If it were not for Sang Sang sewing the spine tightly with cotton thread, it would have turned into paper money and blown away by the wind to pay tribute to the poor sages. It was a pity that after so many years, the pages of the book had been flipped and the words on it had long been deeply engraved in his mind. However, he still could not understand it. Not to mention the initial state of cultivation, he could not even achieve the simplest sense mentioned in the book. He had once been disappointed and even desperate. Later, He became much calmer after knowing that most ordinary people in this world could not understand the chi of heaven and earth. Yes, those legendary sublime people were not ordinary people, they were all abnormal people. Because only the extremely rare abnormal people could understand the chi of heaven and earth. Otherwise, with so many copies of the article on the response of the Tao circulating in the world, why had he not heard of the night sky of Chang, and the capital city, being filled with flying swords and sublime people? Ningke, on the other hand, was very normal, or rather very ordinary. However, if you suddenly found a wonderful mountain of treasures in front of you, but you could only go back empty-handed, and suddenly found that the world was filled with that wonderful thing called primordial chi that looked like invisible white clouds, but you could not even catch a piece of cloud, you would still feel a little unwilling, right? The city of Wei is so poor, and the barbarians on the grassland have long been beaten by His Majesty. They have not dared to come for many years, so I can't accumulate military merits too quickly. Of course, it's good to go back to the capital. Why would I feel unwilling? In the dimly lit military camp, Ningke respectfully bowed to the general in front of him and explained earnestly, "It's just that there's still some time before the registration day of the academy, so I don't think it's necessary to leave so early. Although I haven't improved by leaps and bounds under your command these years, I've been taught by you to be more like a person, or else I wouldn't have been so lucky to enter the academy. I really want to stay with you in the city of Wei for a few more days, to listen to your teachings. Even if it's just for a while, it's good enough to gossip more." Ma Shixiang looked at the lad in front of him, his beard slightly moving, either because of the night wind or because he was very angry. He said angrily, Ningke, when did you become such a shameless guy?" Ningke answered seriously, "As long as you need me to, I can do it at any time. Tell me the truth." Ma Shixiang's expression became cold, and he asked seriously, "Why don't you want to be the guide?" Ningke was silent for a long time, and then he said in a low voice, "General, the nobleman doesn't like me." "The nobleman doesn't like you?" Ma Shixiang scolded him sternly. "You seem to have forgotten your identity. You are not a student of the academy yet, and as a soldier of the empire, you have to obey the orders of your superiors and me. Whether the nobleman likes you or not, it's not something you should worry about. As for whether you like the nobleman or not, no one will care about it. All you need to do is to accept the order and fulfill it." Ningke didn't answer, but looked down at the stubborn grass growing out of the mud in the middle of the military boots, and remained silent to express his opposition. Ma Shixiang couldn't do anything to this lad, and he sighed and said, "What on earth do you want? Why don't you go back to the capital with them?" Ningke raised his head and said seriously, "I saw their caravan outside. They were attacked on the grassland, and there is a spring drought there recently. Last year, Chanyu of the left golden tent died, and the nobleman's maidservant has a dark skin, so I don't dare to go with them. The caravan was attacked, the grassland had a spring drought, Chanyu was dead, and the maidservant had a dark skin." These seemingly unrelated words were pieced together by him, and became the reason for his silence and stubbornness in refusing to leave the city of Wei. Ma Shixiang looked at him and sighed, and asked, "You have already guessed it? Who in the entire city of Wei hasn't guessed who they are?" Ningke helplessly spread out his hands, looked at the other side of the military camp in the night, and said, "Only the idiot princess who grew up in the Chang and imperial palace, married to the grassland, and didn't even know that her husband was dead, would be stupid enough to think that this is a big secret." Chapter 4. The Tang Empire was open-minded, and it was a private conversation in a military tent late at night. But Ma Shixiang still couldn't help becoming nervous when he heard the word, "Her Highness is an idiot." He had been so cautious and nervous since the noble lady entered the city of Wei. He didn't expect that Ningke would make such a harsh comment, and he thought that Ningke's comment was unfair, so he became even more nervous. Everyone knew that the fourth princess of the Tang Empire was not an idiot, but an extremely virtuous princess. With the strength of the Tang Empire and its military prowess, whether it was facing the grassland barbarians or the other countries in the Central Plains, it would never consider such a humiliating political tactic as a marriage alliance. Apart from a few of the most loyal barbarian generals of Emperor Taizu marrying a few daughters of the royal family, there had never been a similar situation. However, 3 years ago, when the grassland was unstable and the largest barbarian tribe of the Golden Tribe was secretly instigated and supported by the hostile countries of the Tang Empire, the fourth princess, who was 13 or 14 years old and loved by the emperor, knelt in front of the Daming Palace, kowtowed and wept blood. Regardless of the opposition of the whole country, she would rather give up the prosperity of Cha, and insisted on marrying the Chanyu of the Golden Tribe to the grassland. When the news spread, the whole world was shocked and people talked about it. The white-haired civil officials sent memorials to the Tang Empire. The emperor was so angry that he smashed countless jade cups. The queen was in a complicated mood and didn't say a word. But all these could not stop the determination of the young princess. After knowing this, the Chanyu of the Golden Tribe of the grassland felt honored and liked the princess's temperament. He sent an envoy with 5,000 cattle and sheep to the court to ask for her hand in marriage. In the end, the Tang emperor had no choice but to let his daughter marry the Chanyu of the grassland in the 11th year of Tianqi era. Less than half a year after the princess married the Chanyu, she and the Chanyu got along well. The once ambitious leader of the barbarians became a calm lion of the grassland. He guarded the country quietly and looked at the foreign land, but he didn't start a war. But no one expected that a few months ago, the Chanyu suddenly died in the prime of his life, and the Chanyu's younger brother forcibly took over the throne. The situation at the border became complicated and tense again. But from the time when the thin girl knelt in front of the Daming Palace to decide the engagement, for 4 or 5 years, the northwest border of the Tang Empire had been in a precious peace. It must be said that most of the credit was due to the princess. Rumor had it that the fourth princess insisted on marrying to the grasslands. A large part of the reason was to avoid the empress. But even if this was true, in the eyes of the military officials and court officials, the fourth princess' act of not relying on the emperor's favor, retreating in front of the empress, and avoiding the intensification of the conflicts in the upper echelons of the empire was a wise and virtuous act. For Tang border generals like Ma Shixiang, they were not afraid of war, let alone those barbarians. They even felt extremely humiliated that the princess was married to the enemy. But no one would refuse the gift of peace. Therefore, their feelings towards Her Royal Highness were very complicated. There was some anger for no reason but also some gratitude. In the end, all kinds of emotions gradually turned into a trace of respect in the depths of their hearts. Ningke was just an ordinary soldier, so he did not know if he could understand the general's complicated feelings. Even if he could, he would not care. Because what he was fighting for now was related to his own safety, and he always thought that there was nothing more important than his own life. So he pretended not to see the general's gloomy face and continued, "I roughly calculated the arrow holes on the carriage. The new Chanyu was very ruthless. I guess at least half of the guards of the princess were killed on the grasslands. It is said that they met the horse gang," Ma Shixiang said with a somewhat unnatural expression. Maybe even he did not believe this. Even the Chanyu of the Golden Tribe would not dare to attack the princess of the Tang Empire. So of course it can only be the horse gang. But everyone knows who disguised as the horse gang. Ningke continued, "But it is not right. Everyone knows that the horse gang is disguised as the cavalrymen of the new Chanyu. How could the barbarian be so bold? Wasn't he afraid that the imperial court would send troops to wipe out the Golden Tribe?" The Tang Empire was founded on martial arts. Its people were simple, brave, and ruthless. It was known as the strongest country in the world and cared most about its dignity. However, if it wanted to wipe out the Golden Tribe of the grassland barbarians, it would probably consume more than half of its power. It seemed impossible to throw the empire into turmoil because of an attack on a married princess. But in fact, in the history of the Tang Empire, such impulsive or heroic stories often happened. The most famous example happened in the later years of the founder of the Tang Empire. At that time, a tribe of the grassland massacred a village on the White Goat Path. 140 villagers were killed. The empire's envoy went to condemn them, but the arrogant Chanyu of the tribe cut off their ears and chased them back. Emperor Taizu flew into a rage and decided to personally conquer the grassland. He mobilized the entire empire and supported a mighty army of 80,000 cavalry to conquer the north. The tribe was terrified and fled when they heard the news. They braved the wind and snow and went straight to the northern wilderness. The Tang Empire's cavalry chased after them and fought for several months. Finally, the tribe was completely annihilated. They fought for several months and killed all the cavalrymen. It seemed simple and elegant, but it hid the terrible price that the Tang Empire paid for it. In order to support this costly war, the imperial court sent millions of people to hunt livestock in the 3 counties of the north and south. The fields around Min Mountain were abandoned and 9 out of 10 houses were empty. The taxes in the south were quadrupled. The people were angry and the officials in the court were unable to take care of the state affairs. The world was in turmoil and even on the verge of collapse. The most wonderful temperament of the Tang Empire appeared in the most dangerous moment, and the evaluation of this matter in the following countless years. When the empire's cavalry went to the wilderness, the rebel army in the south did not take advantage of this good opportunity to attack. Instead, they sneaked back into the mountains and lakes, as if they did not want to be a burden to the empire at this time. Perhaps not everyone in the rebellion would think about the so-called national righteousness. Perhaps some of them wanted to seize this God-given opportunity. However, they had to face a reality: the poor people who had always supported them silently, and many low-level leaders and soldiers in the rebel army, when they decided to seize this opportunity, expressed the most fierce opposition with their footsteps and silence. Tang Taizu, who won this war, did not have a high position in history, even within the empire. Whether it was in the history books or in the stories of the restaurant storytellers, the evaluation of this great emperor was always about his desire for grandeur and success, his use of villains and sycophants, his cruelty, his pursuit of immortality, and so on. But whether it was the most pedantic literati, the most indifferent academy professors, or the most hateful farmers and merchants, they would find all kinds of reasons to scold the founding emperor. However, no one ever thought that the war, which exhausted the power of the country and made the people suffer because of the emperor's anger, should not be fought. Because from the founding of the empire to the present, people living in this land had always insisted on and guarded a simple truth: I don't bully you, but you can't bully me either. Even if I bully you, still can't bully me. Whoever bullies me, I will beat him. This was the founding principle of the Tang Empire. This was the road of the Tang Empire to power. This was the reason why the most powerful country in the world was called Tang. Chapter 5. The Tang Empire was called the Tang Empire because of these simple but powerful things. Ning Ke was not a typical Tang's. He was not brave enough on the battlefield, nor did he have the courage to fight back from the dead or burn his own house for fun. Even if he lived in the city of Wei for another 20 years, it would be impossible for him to write a life drama about growing from a beggar to a general. But he had been in the army long enough to accurately grasp the precious or terrible temperament of the Tangs in this era. So when he found the arrow holes on the princess's team, he immediately deduced something troublesome. The successor of the Chan Yu on the grassland dared to chase after the princess of the Tang Empire. If he was not really crazy, then there must be a real bigwig in the empire who had colluded with him and promised not to be punished by the empire. The fourth princess has now entered the border of the Tang Empire and the city of Wei. But she still hasn't revealed her identity? Why? Because the word trust is not in her mind now. She may trust His Majesty, but certainly not his subjects such as you, the border army, or even the entire imperial court. Because she knows very well that without the approval of some bigwig in Chang, and no barbarians on the grassland would dare to kill her. There are no more than 4 people who can make such a promise to the barbarians and be trusted by the Chanyu. And they are all people that even she can't afford to offend. Even you, General, can only stay far away from this kind of war between the upper echelons of the empire, not to mention small figures like us. Ning Ke rubbed the slightly wet mud with his heel and whispered, something will definitely happen on the road. I can at most deal with 3 to 5 people, and I can't help at all if I get involved. One more person in the team escorting the princess means one more corpse on the mountain road. Without me, the city of Wei can still have a good soldier with good military discipline. General, you can just treat me as the primordial chi of heaven and earth. I'm not very useful and you can't even see me." Looking at the seemingly humble lad, Ma Shixiang rubbed his head and said in a muffled voice, "You compare yourself to the primordial chi of heaven and earth? Is this modesty or boasting? If you really want to persuade me to withdraw this military order, it might be more appropriate to say that you are a fart." Ning Ke chuckled and replied, "I'm going to be a student of the academy soon, so I have to be elegant in my speech." Ma Shixiang did not continue to make fun of the child. After a moment of silence, he frowned and explained, "Actually, it has something to do with you going to the academy. Your military exploits are indeed enough, and you have passed the preliminary test. I have asked my superiors to write a recommendation letter for you, and the military ministry's reply has already arrived." "But do you think that you can enter the academy just like that? You have been staying at the frontier fortress of the city of Wei all these years. Even if you have heard some legends about the academy, you don't know what kind of place it is." The general's expression was solemn and serious. In the hearts of the people of the Tang Empire, the academy is the most sacred and inviolable place. Having the military ministry's acknowledgement only means that you can participate in the academy entrance examination of the academy. However, if you really want to step into the academy's red gate, you have to go to at least 3 departments to get stamped. Why would those departments care about recommendation letters written by high-ranking officers like us? Even if it's a reply from the military headquarters, it doesn't have much power. As long as they want, they can delay the time for you to participate in the academy entrance examination for several years. In recent years, this has become a common sight. Except for the students accepted by the teachers of the academy from among the common people, any candidate recommended by the imperial court has to spend a lot of money to clear the way. I don't know how many wealthy families have lost their fortune just because of the academy entrance examination. I know that you have saved some money in the city of Wei for the past 2 years, but do you think that you can feed those guys with just a few hundred taels of silver?" Ning Ke scratched his head and said with emotion, "No one told me about this before. Because there is a way to solve this problem now, so there is no need to tell you." Ma Shixiang looked at him and said unhappily, "As long as you make a contribution on the road and catch the eye of the nobility, or even if the nobility remembers your name, then any steward in the princess's mansion can just say a few words, and no yaman will dare to blackmail you. This means that I have to gamble with my life for the academy entrance examination of the academy. Why does it sound like a bad deal?" Ning Ke continued to scratch his head. Ma Shixiang stared at him fiercely and scolded, "Idiot! Bastard! In order to enter the academy, I don't know how many people are willing to sell their own mothers and kill their own fathers. Now I just want you to take a small risk, but you are still unwilling to do it." After a while, the general calmed down and advised, "According to my analysis, Your Highness should also know that her whereabouts can't be kept secret. If you can guess her identity, then all the people in the city of Wei can guess it. How can her enemies in the empire not guess it? In this case, she still insists on going as usual, which means that there must be reinforcements ahead. Your task is just to take her to the mountain shortcut and meet those people as soon as possible. How can it be considered gambling with your life?" Ning Ke lowered his head and said nothing. He kept calculating the gains and losses in this. Ma Xiangxing looked at his expression and thought of the irritating temper of this lad. He knew that it was difficult to persuade him to take the risk without some visible benefits. He could not help but sigh and said in a low voice, "There is an old man in the team of Your Highness. His surname is Liu, and I heard that he cultivates in the South School of Haotian Taoism." Hearing this, Ning Ke suddenly raised his head, and his usually calm and lazy eyes suddenly became extremely bright. Ma Xiangxing looked at him and said with emotion, "You came to the city of Wei when you were still a little boy. You used your sweet words and skills to please all the young and old men in the city. The soldiers changed one batch after another. Even the meat pie shop in the eastern city had changed 2 bosses. But you are still the most favored little boy in the city of Wei, the bandit's nest." He rubbed Ning Ke's head as if he was looking at a spoiled child, and said, That year before the former general passed away, he got you a military record. Then in the autumn when we went to the grassland to collect firewood, we were almost killed by those barbarians. It was only because of you that we escaped. At that time, all the people in the city of Wei unanimously decided to reward you. We even thought that even if your condition was to use the capital's most popular prostitute, we would all pool our money to do it beautifully. The gray-haired general changed the topic and said bitterly, but no one expected that you would want to learn those extraterrestrial methods. It's so frustrating. The entire city of Wei, even the entire 7 stockade villages, could not find a teacher for you. We could only watch you read the article on the response of the Tao until it was torn and tattered, and we could do nothing about it. But now is the opportunity. Ma Xiangxing's eyes suddenly became sharp. Whether it is the academy or the old man surnamed Liu, you must catch them. You must catch them. Ning Ke was silent for a long time, and then he lowered his head and sighed softly. Actually, I'm still a little reluctant. The starlight outside the window was faint. Ma Xiangxing looked at the lad and said, the city of Wei is too small after all. You should go to the capital Chang and to the real big world. Maybe there are many fierce dragons and tigers in those places, but you are a newborn calf. Who are you really afraid of? At least, those places will not only have a tattered article on the response of the Tao. Chapter 6. In the south of the city of Wei, there was a small ditch that was not even a stream. Beside the ditch was a small slope that was not even a hill. Below the slope was a hut with a fence and a stone floor that was not even a small courtyard. The rain clouds dispersed early in the night, and the exceptionally bright starlight sprinkled on the ditch, slope and hut, instantly plating them with a very beautiful silver halo. Ning Ke dragged his shoes and walked slowly under the starlight, looking at the hut in front of him that he and Sang Sang had lived in for a long time. He could not help but slow down. But as long as he was walking, no matter how slow he was, he would arrive at his destination one day. He pushed open the fence that could only stop dogs but not people, and walked to the oil lamp that leaked through the crack of the door. He raised his hand to cover his mouth, coughed twice, and said, "What if we go to the capital?" The door of the hut was pushed open, and the sharp squeaking sound pierced the quiet night of the border city. The little handmaiden Sang Sang squatted at the door, and her thin figure was elongated by the oil lamp. She pressed the wooden door with her finger and replied, "Haven't you always wanted to go to Chang'an?" "Oh yes, Ning Ke, when are you going to steal some oil from the firearms camp? This door has been ringing for months, and the sound is really terrible. Who still uses those terrible firearms now? If it's just oil, I will go to the military camp tomorrow and ask." Ning Ke answered casually, and then suddenly understood something. "Ah, that's not what I wanted to talk to you about. If we really want to leave, why bother with this broken door?" Sang Sang stood up with her hands on her knees, and her thin body looked especially thin in the cool spring night wind. She looked at Ning Ke and said in a serious and soft voice without any other emotions, "Even if we leave, there will still be people living in this house, and they will still open the door. After the two of them left, would there really be people willing to live in this remote and broken hut far away from the marketplace?" Ning Ke thought silently, and did not know why he suddenly had some feelings of reluctance. He sighed softly and squeezed past Sang Sang, and said in a low voice, "Pack your belongings tonight." Sang Sang casually combed the yellow hair on her temples, looked at his back and asked, "Ning Ke, I don't understand why you are so interested in that matter. No one can resist the temptation of becoming stronger. Also, those things are really interesting to me." Ning Ke knew that the little handmaiden had guessed his thoughts. He looked up at Song Song's tanned face and raised his eyebrows, saying, "And we can't stay in the city of Wei forever. The world is so big, and there are many other countries besides the empire. We have to go and have a look." Even if it's just to earn more money and get promoted faster, going to Chang and is much better than staying in the city of Wei. So I must get into the academy this time. Song Song's face revealed a thoughtful expression. Because of her young age, the little handmaiden's eyebrows and eyes did not grow long, And because of the sandstorm in the border town, her little face was tanned and rough. Coupled with the yellow hair caused by childhood malnutrition, she was not good-looking, not even delicate. However, she had a pair of willow leaf-like eyes, long and thin, and her pupils were as bright as ice. In addition, she rarely showed any obvious expression, so she didn't look like an 11 or 12-year-old handmaiden who was born in a miserable family. Instead, she looked like a mature woman who knew everything and had seen through the world. The extreme contrast between her real age, appearance and eyes made her look especially cold and stylish. Ning Ke knew that these were all illusions. In his view, the little handmaiden Sang Sang was a typical simple-minded girl. They had depended on each other for so many years, and because she was used to thinking and doing things by herself, she became more and more lazy. Because of this, she became more and more stupid. In order to cover up her clumsiness, she used fewer and fewer words in every sentence, which made her look more and more silent, cold, mature, and weird. Not stupid, it should be clumsy. He thought of something and corrected her in his heart. After a long silence, Sang Sang suddenly raised her head, bit her lips, and showed a rare timid expression. She said, "I heard. Chang'an is very big and there are many people. The capital is prosperous, and I heard that in the third year of the Tianqi era, the population had already exceeded 1 million. Living expenses are very expensive, and it is not easy to live in peace for a long time." Ning Ke sighed. Seeing the little handmaiden's nervous expression, he smiled and comforted her. "There is nothing to be afraid of even if there are many people. You can just treat Chang'an as a bigger city of Wei. When the time comes, I will deal with the outsiders, and you can handle the affairs of the family as usual. If you are really afraid, you should not go out. How much does it cost to buy meat, vegetables, and rice in the capital for a month?" Song Song's willow leaf-like eyes were wide open, and her two small hands tightly grasped the hem of her cloth skirt. She asked nervously, "Will it be more than 4 taels of silver? That is twice as much as the city of Wei. If I really get into the academy, you have to get me some good cloth to make some clothes. In addition, there may be guests at home such as classmates. If any gentleman takes a fancy to your young master, he may also come to work at home, so you have to at least make a new set of clothes. I have roughly calculated it will cost at least 10 taels of silver." Ning Ke answered with a frown. In fact, he was very serious about it. He was not very clear that 10 taels of silver, to the students of the academy, might be the price of a table of banquets in a big restaurant in the heavenly fragrance market. Just like the famous joke in Hushi Road, a farmer who worked in the fields always imagined that the Empress of the East was baking meat pies, and the Empress of the West was peeling green onions. The meat pies were like the sea, and the green onions were like the mountains. However, even this obviously wrong answer had far exceeded the bottom line of the little handmaiden's heart. She frowned and looked at him seriously and suggested, "It is too expensive. Ning Ke, let's not go to Chang'an, and you should also not enter the academy, okay? You are so ignorant." Ning Ke reprimanded, "If I enter the academy, I will definitely become an official. At that time, you and I will spend 10 taels of silver a month, and I will casually earn 70 or 80 taels of silver a month in the yamen. Besides, what is wrong with Chang'an? Chenjinji Cosmetic Store doesn't need too much rouge and powder." The words rouge and powder seemed to be the little handmaiden's weakness. She tightly pursed her lips, obviously in a very fierce psychological struggle. After a long time, she replied in a mosquito-like voice, "But what about the years you study in the academy? My needlework is ordinary, and the people of Chang'an must have high standards. I may not be able to sell it. This is indeed troublesome. I heard that hunting is not allowed around Chang'an, and those mountains and forests belong to the emperor. How much money do we have left?" The master and the handmaiden looked at each other, and then tacitly walked to the 2 big elm chests. They opened the chests and took out a very tightly wrapped wooden box from the deepest part of the chest. The wooden box was filled with scattered pieces of silver. There were obvious scratches on the fingernail-sized pieces of silver, and there was only one big piece of silver in the middle. At first glance, one could tell that it was accumulated bit by bit on a daily basis, but there wasn't much of it. Looking at the scattered silver in the wooden box, neither of them counted it. Sang Sang whispered as usual, count it once every 5 days. I just counted it last night. 76 taels and 4 phoan. It seems that we have to find a way to earn more money after we go to Chong, and Ning Ke said seriously. Yes, I will strive to improve my needlework. Sang Sang answered seriously. At night, Sang Sang knelt on the Kong bed and tidied up the bedding. Her skinny knees moved quickly, and her small palm pressed the middle of the pillow to make an arc, which was the most comfortable angle for Ning Ke to sleep. Then she picked up her bedding and jumped off the cold Kong. She walked to the 2 big elm chests in the corner and began to make her own bed. After the lights went out, Ning Ke put the bowl of water on the windowsill and got into bed under the starlight. He put his hands on the edge of the quilt and yawned. Then he let out a very satisfied sigh and closed his eyes. After a while, he heard the rustling sound that he had heard for years coming from the corner of the room. It was a night that seemed no different from the past years. They would fall asleep with the starlight at the frontier fortress of the empire. However, the truth was that the master and the handmaiden in the hut were not asleep today. Maybe it was because of the excitement of stepping into a new world, or maybe it was because of the prosperity of Chong and the vague wealth and the charming fragrance of the cosmetics. The 2 breathing sounds by the window and the corner of the hut could not calm down. After a long time, Ning Ke opened his eyes and looked at the faint silver halo on the window paper. He said absent-mindedly, I heard that the girls in Chong'an are not afraid of the cold. They wear thin clothes with wide-open necklines. Their bodies are very white. I don't know if it's true. I was too young to remember. He turned over and looked at the dark corner of the hut. He asked Sang Sang, have you been sick recently? Are you cold? The little handmaiden seemed to shake her head in the dark. He could vaguely see her clenching the corner of the quilt. Her eyes were closed, but there was a rare smile on her lips. She murmured, I heard that the girls in Chong'an are indeed very white. They use such good cosmetics every day. How can they not be white? Ning Ke smiled and looked at her. He said, don't worry. When I have money in the future, you can buy all the cosmetics in Chinjinji Cosmetics Store. Sang Sang suddenly opened her eyes. Her willow leaf-like eyes reflected the bright starlight. She said seriously, Ning Ke, this is what you promised. I just said that when you go to Chong'an you must remember to call me young master so that it shows respect. It had been 7 or 8 years since Ning Ke found the cold little Sang Sang from the pile of corpses by the roadside and came to the city of Wei. Although Sang Sang was registered as a maidservant and did the work of a maidservant, she had never called him young master. This did not mean anything else. It was just a habit. Today, the little handmaiden Sang Sang was forced to abandon this habit. Ning Ke, young master. You must remember to buy me cosmetics in Chinjinji Cosmetics Store. Ning Ke responded. His eyes fell on the frost-like starlight on the ground beside the Kong. His heart tightened for no reason. The feeling of emptiness from many years ago came again. He looked back at the dark blue night sky outside the window. He looked at the sky full of stars. Then he lowered his head and began to miss his hometown. He murmured, there is still no moon today. Sang Sang, who was on the elm cabinet in the dark corner of the hut, curled up in the cool quilt like a little mouse. She reached behind her waist and pulled it to block the cool air outside. She also made the gap between the 2 cabinets less uncomfortable. Listening to the murmurs coming from the window, she thought to herself, Ning Ke, young master is talking nonsense again. Chapter 7. Early in the morning, the master and the handmaiden woke up and began to pack their luggage in the dim morning light. They argued occasionally, but mostly stayed silent. Ning Ke rummaged for a long time on the mud wall outside the hut and took out a long bag. He took out the bow and arrow from the bag and checked it carefully for a long time. After confirming that there was no problem, he handed it over. Sang Sang took it and stuffed it into the big package made of cotton cloth. Then she took out 3 slightly rusty straight knives with sheaths from under the fence frame. Ning-Kei took them and carefully wiped them. He looked at the sharp edge against the morning sun, knotted and tied them tightly to his back with a straw rope. He took out a black umbrella from behind the door, and tied it to Song Song's back with the last piece of straw rope. He didn't know what the black umbrella was made of, but it seemed to be covered with a layer of black oil stains. It didn't reflect light and looked a little heavy. Moreover, the umbrella looked very big. Even if it was closed and tied, it almost fell to the ground on Song Song's thin and short body. Ning-Kei and Sang-Sang stepped over the broken fence wall one after the other. They looked back at the small bluestone ground and the small broken hut at the same time. Sang-Sang looked up at his chin and asked, "Young master, do you want to lock the door?" "No." Ning-Kei was silent for a while and said, "In the future, it may be difficult for us to come back." The iron-wrapped wooden wheels rolled over the soft muddy ground. The noble's carriage slowly set off, heading out of the city of Wei. The 5 carriages with soft ropes in front and behind were very eye-catching at any time in the frontier fortress. Today, there were indeed many people who came to see them off, but their focus was not on the noble's team of horses, but on the young man and the little handmaiden sitting in the first carriage. From time to time, boiled eggs would be handed to them, and from time to time, an auntie with black cheeks would wipe her eyes with a dirty handkerchief and say something. "Ning-Kei, you wicked bastard. My distant nephew is such a good man, but you refused to let Sang-Sang marry him. Now you want this girl to follow you to those ruthless places. I tell you, you have to take good care of my Sang-Sang." Ning-Kei, who was sitting on the shaft of the carriage, looked terrible. He replied, "Auntie, you started to propose marriage when Sang-Sang was only 8 years old. You can't do that." After a few curses with laughter, it suddenly began to drizzle. The raindrops, which were thinner than threads, sprinkled on people's bodies. It was a little cold, but no one left. The families of the soldiers in the city of Wei were busy bidding farewell to Ning-Kei and calculating the final debt with him. The crowd was noisy and noisy. The curtain of the most exquisitely decorated carriage in the back lifted a corner, and the proud and indifferent maidservant poked her head out to take a look. Her beautiful eyebrows couldn't help but furrow. Just as the team was about to leave this small border town, Ning-Kei stood up from the horse carriage and saluted to the surroundings. The young man carried 3 old sabers on his back. Standing in the rain, he clasped his fists and palms together in salute. Unexpectedly, he gave off a heroic aura. "Young and old masters, sisters and aunts, I don't need to say too many words of thanks." After saying this, he opened his arms in the rain, clenched his fists, and opened them up, showing off his not-so-strong chest muscles and arms. He struck a particularly stupid pose and shouted, "If I don't make a name for myself in Chong, and this time I won't come back." His words sounded like a storyteller dropping a log to start a play, or a bloody head falling into the dust. The people by the roadside cheered in unison. In the only decent tavern in the city of Wei, Ma Shixiang and several trusted lieutenants were drinking. The nobleman didn't want them to see him off, and they didn't bother to see Ning-Kei off. However, they clearly saw the scene in front of them. One of the lieutenants thought of what Ning-Kei said on the horse carriage and couldn't help sighing. "You won't come back if you can't make a name for yourself? It seems that it will be very difficult for this stupid boy to come back." Ma Shixiang, who was sitting at the table, thought of the 3 short sentences that Ning-Kei said to him last night. He couldn't help but stroke his flowery beard and felt very comforted. Looking at the horse carriage that was gradually driving out of the city, he said softly with a smile, "It's good that he won't come back. You wicked thing, go and do harm to the outside world." The distance from the city of Wei meant the distance from the grassland. The spring drought that was troubling the barbarian tribes, and the new Chanyu didn't affect this place. The spring breeze turned the branches and leaves green, and then dyed the carriage wheels and horse hooves, attracting a few butterflies from time to time. The horses galloped between the meadow and the hills. The soft rope was sometimes as tight as iron, and sometimes as loose as a leaf. The luxurious carriage covered with several layers of quilts and blankets also moved up and down gently. The pretty maidservant stared blankly at the scenery passing by quickly outside the window. Perhaps she was thinking of the north where the yellow sand was dancing in the wind at this time. Her facial expression was a bit stiff, but her eyes were full of expectation and eagerness for the unknown future. Inside the carriage, a little boy dressed in luxurious light fur clothes was holding her calf and looking up longingly. He mumbled a few words in Central Plains Chinese, as if he wanted to go out to play for a while. The maidservant turned around and scolded the little boy severely. Then her expression became gentle again. She held him in her arms and rubbed his head affectionately. A corner of the curtain was lifted by the wind, and the spring breeze blew on her cheeks, which were no longer as tender as before. The maidservant squinted slightly and looked at the front of the team with a gloomy expression. The young soldier named Ninkei was sitting on the shaft of the relatively simple carriage at the very front. He kept nodding his head as if he was about to fall asleep. As a guide, he was supposed to lead the way for the whole team, but he was dozing off most of the time. No matter how one looked at it, he couldn't be considered competent. The maidservant's expression was not because of this, but because of a detail in the scene she saw. Ninkei was dozing on the shaft of the carriage, and it seemed that he would fall from the galloping carriage at any time. So the little maidservant Sang stayed vigilantly by his side, trying to support him with her thin and short body. Her expression could not be seen clearly on her dark face, but it could be felt that she was very tired. At this moment, the caravan ran over a very shallow grassy stream. Ninkei was awakened by the shock. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the sky. He found that he had slept until dusk, so he raised his hand to signal the caravan to stop and set up camp. It seemed a little irresponsible and reckless to set up camp right after waking up, but no one in the team objected to his arrangement. It had been several days since they left the city of Wei, and every decision made by the young man along the way had been proven to be correct. Whether it was the choice of route, the location of the camp, the security, the use of water to eat, or the convenience of escape, there was no fault to be found. What was even more amazing was that the caravan moved quite fast. The dozens of barbarian horse gangs subdued by the noblemen in the grassland had originally looked down on the border army of the city of Wei, but now they only had admiration for the young soldier's ability as a guide. On the bank of the stream, people silently dug earth, built stoves, and collected firewood to boil water. The maidservant got off the expensive carriage that was heavily protected. She looked at Ninkei, who was lying on the grass and rubbing his stomach as if he was on a picnic, and at the thin and dark handmaiden who was struggling to fetch water, set up a pot, and collect firewood. She frowned even more. A strong guard next to her stood up and glanced at her. She shook her head, indicating that there was no need to follow. She walked along the bank of the stream and through the smoke. She had to admit that the lad named Ninkei was indeed capable. He was much better than those young noblemen in the capital of Chang, and who thought that they were outstanding. If he was really a noble young master in Chang, and she might have some appreciation for his behavior. However, he was after all just a vulgar lad at the bottom of society. Yet he was oppressing the little girl who should have been sharing weal and woe with him. Unknowingly, he had touched a certain part of her heart, and she was extremely unhappy. She walked to the little handmaiden Sang and smiled gently at her, indicating that she should put down the heavy firewood in her hands and talk to her. Sang glanced at Ninkei and waited for him to nod before she walked over. The pretty handmaiden took out a square handkerchief from her waist, but Sang shook her head. The little handmaiden had done so much strenuous work, but there was not a single drop of sweat on her forehead. At this time, Ninkei finally climbed up from the meadow. He brushed off the grass on his body and the green grass juice on his cotton shirt. He smiled and cupped his hands in front of his chest. The handmaiden did not turn to look at him. She said lightly, "I don't like you, so you don't have to try to get close to me. People like you may look childish on the surface and treat others warmly and delightfully, but in reality, you are filled with a sense of stale old age, which is disgusting." Her tone was emotionless, and her chin was slightly raised. She did not seem to be deliberately keeping a distance, but naturally revealed a condescending air of nobility. As a personal handmaiden serving the Princess of Tang, she could even order most of the officials of the empire around, let alone a small character like Ninkei. Ninkei smiled and shook his head. He turned around and walked to the earthen stove by the stream. He only had a little handmaiden. The noble had countless handmaidens. His only little handmaiden was taken away by one of the countless handmaidens of the noble to gossip. The noble had other servants to serve him, but he had to burn firewood and boil water to cook by himself. Perhaps it was because the sandstorm at the frontier fortress made him very thick-skinned. There was no embarrassment in his smile at all. When the sun was about to set, Sang Sang came back with a lot of snacks such as dried milk. Ning-Ke was holding a bowl of burnt meat porridge in a daze. When he saw it, he took it without hesitation and stuffed it into his mouth. He asked vaguely, "Why does she like to chat with you so much? She doesn't know that I haven't had a proper meal for a few days." The cheap sympathy of the noble is sometimes not used in the right place. Look at her smile, it's like a grandmother wolf who wants to eat little girls. She thinks she is gentle and decent, but it's more fake than the watered-down wine sold in the city of Wei. She's a good person. Sang Sang picked up the burnt porridge beside him. She lifted the curtain and was about to leave to cook again, but was called back by him. "What did you talk about these days?" Ning-Ke asked. Sang Sang frowned and tried hard to recall for a long time. Then she replied, "It seems like, I don't like to talk." Most of the time it was her talking about the grassland, but I can't remember what she said. Upon hearing this, Ning-Ke's mood became much better. He gently hummed a tune and chewed the delicious dried milk. He said, "If she talks to you again in the future, remember to ask for money from her, or bring more of this dried milk back. It's not a bad idea." At night, Sang Sang used the stream water to extinguish the fire. After careful confirmation, she dragged the bucket of hot water to the small tent. People on the slope beside the stream saw this scene and knew that the little handmaiden was preparing the water for Ning-Ke to wash his feet. Many people showed disdainful expressions at the same time. Of course, this disdain was for Ning Quebec. After washing his feet, Ning-Ke crawled into the wool mattress and hugged the pair of cold feet that stretched out from the opposite side into his arms. He made a moan that was unknown whether it was pleasure or pain. After 2 yawns, he said, "Go to sleep." Sang Sang was much more tired than him during the day, and fell into a deep sleep after a while. Ning-Ke didn't know when he opened his eyes again. His gaze seemed to penetrate the tent that had been mended with many scars, falling on the starry sky, and then on a handkerchief. Recalling the handkerchief with golden edges taken out by the handmaiden, he knew that his guess was indeed correct, but he didn't know what use it was even if he guessed correctly. Chapter 8. Looking at the top of the tent, Ning-Ke thought of the traces after he left the city of Wei. Along the way, the curtain of the luxurious horse carriage was always closed. Except for the little boy, who obviously had barbarian blood, who occasionally got off the carriage to play, there was no chance to see the princess at all. Only the delicate and arrogant maidservant gave orders from time to time. Somehow, the maidservant liked to call Sang Sang over for a chat. Or somehow, the maidservant did not hide her dislike for him at all. Ning-Ke felt that she was a very good actress, because no matter in the city of Wei or on the journey, it was hard to tell that she was not a maidservant from the attitude of those grassland men and her temperament and expression. It was this point that made him feel a little strange. He always thought that the real nobles in the upper class of the Tang Empire should not have too much sympathy for Sang Sang. But these were not the things he really cared about. In the past few days, he had been paying attention to the old man in an old robe in the horse carriage. If he guessed correctly, the old man with a gentle expression should be the sublime being from the South School of Hautian Taoism mentioned by General Ma. Since he was very young, Ning-Ke had been determined to step into that mysterious world, but he could not find the right way. He was willing to go back to the capital with this team because there was such a real cultivator in the team. Unfortunately, along the way, he had never found a chance to talk to the old man who was closely protected. Only when they stopped to eat in the camp, he could occasionally meet the old man's eyes for a moment. At that moment, He seemed to see the gentleness and even encouragement in the old man's eyes, which made him a little puzzled. Ning-Ke could not figure it out after thinking and analyzing, so he withdrew his attention. Only then did he find that the pair of little feet in his arms had not been warmed, and were still as cold as a lump of ice. Even his chest and abdomen were cold. He could not help but frown worriedly. The little handmaiden Sang-Sang had suffered too much when she was young. She was wrapped in wind and rain and rotten air by the side of the road for several days, and after being picked up by him, she became seriously ill and did not recover for several months. The military doctor in the city of Wei had examined her, and he had even taken her to the faraway Kaiping prefecture to have a look. All the doctors had the same opinion: congenitally deficient with a weak and cold constitution. Due to her extremely cold physique, Sang-Sang rarely sweated. She could not expel the waste toxins that were produced every day, which made her body worse and worse over time. Therefore, Ning-Ke followed the doctor's advice and made her do a large amount of exercise every day to slightly improve the cold environment in her body. This was also the real reason why he always ordered this dark and skinny little handmaiden around like a donkey in the eyes of others. Even if she worked so hard every day, it didn't always warm her up. For example, at this moment the woolen mattress was like an ice house. Ning-Ke got up and rubbed his frozen stomach. He took out the leather wineskin from the corner and patted Sang-Sang awake. Then he put the wineskin to her lips. Sang-Sang opened her eyes in a daze and took the wineskin naturally. She skillfully unscrewed the cork and tilted her head back to pour the wine into her mouth. Not a single drop of wine spilled out, but the tent was still filled with the spicy aroma of wine. It seemed to be the strong wine used in the grassland. The skinny little handmaiden held the big wineskin and drank to her heart's content. 2 bowls of strong wine could knock out a big man, but she drank half of the bag in one go until her stomach slightly bulged. It was hard to describe this scene as heroic, but a little weird. She wiped her lips, and her willow-like eyes became brighter in the dark. It was impossible to tell that she had drunk wine. She smiled at Ning-Ke and then fell back to sleep. The room was filled with the strong aroma of wine. The cold feet in his arms gradually warmed up. Ning-Ke looked at the few drops of sweat on the tip of her nose and finally felt relieved. He wiped the sweat on his forehead. Ning-Ke wrapped the woolen mattress tightly and slowly closed his eyes. Not far from his face was the tattered article on the response of the Tao. Every day before he slept, he would read a few pages. Even if he didn't read it, he would silently recite it in his heart. It was a habit that he had developed over the years. May all living beings cultivate the art of dying of old age. May all disasters and poisons not harm their lives. May all living beings never grow old or get sick, live a long life, and enter the path of wisdom bravely. In his light sleep, his mind began to slowly circulate along with the words on the scroll, along with those seemingly simple but actually muddy and difficult to understand perception techniques. Gradually, the woolen mattress covering him and Sang-Sang disappeared. The simple tent disappeared. The grass outside the tent disappeared. And the stream turned into a cloud of white mist and then became invisible. The whole world became a world of mutual existence. In this world, they could vaguely feel some kind of breathing in a mysterious rhythm. Between the breath of the world gradually became a sea, and it was a warm world. Ning-Ke was no stranger to this magical feeling. Many years ago, after he read the article on the response of the Tao for the first time, he could often feel it before he fell asleep. But he was very clear about the sad fact that this was not a real feeling after meditation, but a dream. The warm ocean was probably an illusion in the dream, because the pair of feet wrapped in thick cotton socks in his arms gradually became warm. But it was also a very beautiful illusion. Comforting himself in this way, Ning-Ke fell into a deep sleep. It was a dark and sweet night without dreams. When he woke up the next morning, Ning-Ke slept very well. But his expression was full of shock and dissatisfaction, as if he wanted to sleep for another 3 days and 3 nights. Why did you change the route? Looking at the indifferent maidservant in front of him, he suppressed his emotions and said as gently as possible, "Go through Min Mountain and straight to Huaxi Road. There will be no problem with the route I chose. No one in the tent, including the maidservant, answered his question. I am the guide, and you are not familiar with Min Mountain at all. Ningke looked at the maidservant and said after a moment of silence, I know you are worried about being ambushed. I can assure you that as long as you listen to me, no one can stop you. The maidservant looked at him as if looking at a stone. What she wanted to express was very clear. What qualifications do you have for me to explain to you? Returning to his own tent, Ningke looked at Sang Sang who was packing and said, Send them to this road and we will leave immediately. Taking out the simple map that he had drawn years ago, he pointed at a place and said, This is the furthest we can follow them. If we go any further, they will only need to send a few teams of horses to kill this team. You should persuade them. Sang Sang said with her head raised. I guess there are troops coming to the rescue of the princess, so they will not listen to me. Ningke replied, I am not good at persuading a group of pig-like companions. Sang Sang did not speak but asked with her eyes, Since there are people coming to the rescue, why are you still so worried and even ready to slip away halfway? My intuition is wrong. Ningke replied, Because I believe that a fierce person who dares to assassinate the fourth princess of the Tang Empire will not be as stupid as that woman. She has a few backup plans. Sang Sang wanted to say something but stopped and reminded him, You should speak politely to her. I know her real identity. Ningke raised his eyebrows and said sarcastically, So what if she is a princess? I have said in the city of Wei that she is an idiot princess. Chapter 9. Even if they are looking for help, the choice of location is very important. If it were up to me, I would rather choose a road than a pine ridge. Ningke looked at the eye-catching ink marks on the hand-drawn map and said, They chose to take the northern mountain road, but they didn't realize that it was a one-way road with dense forests on both sides of the 7-mile road, which was very easy to set up an ambush. After saying this, he kept silent for a moment and put the hand-drawn map into his clothes. He shook his head and said in a self-mocking tone, It seems that the so-called guide, besides leading them to the northern mountain road, is just trying to confuse the enemy. That idiot princess has never trusted General Ma, so naturally she won't trust me. An idiot leading a group of idiots. Thinking of the possible ambush on the northern mountain road and the possible reinforcement, he became more and more depressed. He lowered his voice and said fiercely, She hasn't become smarter after staying on the grassland for nearly a year. I really don't know where her reputation comes from. Ningke pulled out the 3 rusty knives from the sheaths, opened the water bottle and wet the grindstone. He began to sharpen the blades silently. There might be a series of bloody battles after entering the northern mountain road. It might be a little late to sharpen the knives, but at least he could calm down. If we are separated from them after entering the northern mountain road, what about the things you want to ask that old man? Sang Sang asked in confusion. Survival is the most important thing. Ningke lowered his head and sharpened the knives slowly but firmly. As long as we can reach Chong and alive, there will always be a chance to learn those things. If we put our lives in the hands of those idiots, there will be no chance. The further south they went, the warmer it was. Logically speaking, the scenery outside the window should be more vibrant and lush. However, as the team entered the vast Min Mountain, the grass around the team gradually disappeared and turned into tall trees. The leaves were not fully green yet, and there was still a sense of killing accumulated from last autumn and winter. As the temperature dropped, a tense and depressing atmosphere enveloped the whole team. Everyone knew that if the bigwig in Chong, and who dared to murder the princess, wanted to stop the princess from returning to the capital safely, then the Min Mountain between the frontier fortress and the county would be his last chance. After several days of intense vigilance and searching, the caravan finally arrived at the periphery of the northern mountain road. Looking at the dense forest that covered the sky, most of the people in the caravan were not as worried as Ning Quebec. Instead, they seemed to be much more relaxed. The pretty maidservant spent less time chatting with Sang Sang these days and spent most of her time in the second carriage. When she got off the carriage this evening, she had a faint smile on her face. When she decided to leave the grassland, she had already sent a messenger to the empire. Although she could not reach Chang, and in a short time for the imperial court to send a large number of troops to meet them, she had enough time to contact her loyal subordinates. After receiving the urgent reply from the Gushan commandery 10 days ago, she decided to go straight to the northern mountain road without hesitation. She believed that the young senior captain of the Gushan commandery, Hua Shangyue, should have led his personal battalion to the southern exit of the northern mountain road. She had left the Tang Empire for less than a year, but she firmly believed that her loyal subordinates were still loyal to her. Even if some of them had been bribed by the woman in the imperial palace, Hua Shangyue would never be bribed because his eyes were always so gentle when he looked at her. When they were more than 30 miles away from the appointed meeting place, the team began to pitch camp and rest in the dusk. It was very risky to travel through the dense forest in the middle of the night. Some bodyguards even suggested that the team should simply wait outside the northern mountain road until Hua Shanyue's troops came to meet them. She was still thinking about this suggestion. However, no matter how she looked at it, she and Buchi were now very safe, so a smile appeared on her pretty face again. The songs and laughter that had been suppressed for several days returned to the campsite. In the twilight, a simple and crude tent was set up alone outside the circle of carriages. The head of the princess's bodyguards had raised a question, but the owner of the tent insisted and refused to move into the carriage formation made up of 5 carriages and chests. If we don't stay away from their carts, we won't have enough time to escape if something happens, Ning Kei explained with slight mockery. He tied the big black umbrella with a straw rope and asked Sang Sang to carry it on her back. Then he tied the knot of the straw rope into a very beautiful flower. Sang Sang raised her head and looked at his pale blue chin, where stubble had just appeared. She asked, "What about them if we escape?" Ning Kei was checking whether the bow tendons were damp. After hearing this question, he turned his head and quietly looked at the little handmaiden's dark face. After a long silence, he said seriously, "You may have forgotten what happened when you were a child, but I haven't. I dug you out from a pile of corpses. I survived when I was a child, and I also experienced tragedies that ordinary people can't even imagine. Sang Sang, you must always remember this. We have worked very, very hard, and even risked our lives to continue to live in this world. Since we have worked so hard to survive, we can't die so easily." After saying this, Ning Kei did not give any further explanation. He sheathed the sharpened padao back into its scabbard, then used a straw rope to tie it a few times. After testing the distance between the scabbards was just right, he carried it on his back. Sang Sang did not ask any more questions and began to pack silently. She used her little hand to test the flatness of each arrow. She knew that the moment night fell, it would be the moment for her and Ning Kei to seek refuge in the vast Min Mountain. She was not afraid because when she was a child, she had traveled through such dark mountains and forests countless times on Ning Kei's back. At this moment, Ning Kei's hand holding the sheath slightly stiffened. The curtains of the simple and crude tent were lifted by a hand and the maidservant walked in. The smile on her delicate face immediately turned into an icy cold expression. She had intended to chat with Sang Sang, but did not expect to see the scene of the master and handmaiden packing their luggage. She easily guessed that they wanted to leave. "What do you want to do?" She coldly stared at Ning Kei's face and said, "At this moment, it's hard not to be suspicious of your behavior." After a moment of silence, Ning Kei laughed and was about to explain. Suddenly, his ears trembled slightly and the dimples on his cheeks disappeared, replaced by a solemn expression that had not been seen before. He quickly carried the 3 knives on his back, pushed aside the maidservant and walked out of the tent rudely. The camp was outside the entrance of the northern mountain road, and was bathed in the last twilight. It was warm and extremely comfortable, but at this moment it seemed to be stained with a layer of blood red. The wind passed through the forest that had just woken up in spring, whistling low, as if there were ghosts crying. Ning Kei frowned and looked into the depths of the forest, carefully listening to the details of the whistling. Suddenly, he shouted loudly, "Enemy attack!" The murmur in the forest finally revealed the truth. A feather arrow struck from the forest like lightning, whistling mournfully and shooting at the luxurious carriage in the array of carriages. Chapter 10. A muffled sound was heard. Like a sharp metal thorn stabbing into dozens of stacked wet papers, the arrow shot into the chest of a bodyguard beside the luxurious carriage. The bearded young man covered his bleeding chest and fell down. At the moment when Ninkei shouted that the enemy was under attack, the well-trained bodyguard of the princess quickly reacted. The bodyguard bravely jumped onto the shaft of the carriage and blocked the window of Her Highness's carriage. He did not know where the arrow would be shot, but he knew that Her Highness inside the carriage must be the enemy's first target, and he could not let Her Highness's life be threatened. The brave bodyguard made the right bet, and the price he paid was his young life. Enemy attack! Protect Her Highness! Shield! The bodyguards roared angrily and in shock. Countless arrows shot out densely from the depths of the dense forest like a rainstorm, and they whistled as they instantly caused the whistling sound of the wind to vanish without a trace, causing it to seem extremely terrifying. Ninkei, who was still some distance away from the circle, immediately lay down. At the same time, he did not forget to throw Sang Sang and the maidservant who followed him out of the tent. He fell heavily in the forest, but he did not feel much pain because the ground was covered with hundreds of thousands of years old rotten pine leaves on the northern mountain road. With his face against the slightly cool leaves, he listened to the dense sounds of arrows piercing through the air in front of him, and occasionally listened to the sound of arrows flying over his head. He silently calculated the number of archers and the number of arrows they used. The entrance of the northern mountain road was surrounded by the angry and anxious shouts of the bodyguards, the orders to set up defenses, and the extremely heavy sound of shields being set up. The big shields made of carriage boards were inserted into the edge of the shafts by the bodyguards, which played a great role. Thud! 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 The arrows fiercely pierced into the simple wooden shields, making a dull sound like a war drum, but it was more frequent and terrifying than the craziest war drum. From time to time, some arrows shot through the gaps of the simple wooden shields and hit the bodyguards, causing a muffled groan. Unfortunately, the horses that were hit by the arrows were not as fierce and strong as the men of the empire, and fell to the ground in pain and wailed. The sound of arrows piercing through the air, the sound of arrows hitting wooden shields, the muffled groans of people, and the mournful neighing of horses were mixed together, turning the camp that was previously shrouded in warm twilight into a sure hell. Xiao! An arrow fiercely shot into the mud less than half a foot in front of Ninkei, splashing soil and gravel on his face, instantly leaving a red mark. However, his facial expression did not change at all. He quietly crawled on the rotten pine needles, looking through the gaps between the leaves, over the shaft of the arrow, and at the distant northern mountain road in the south. The enemy did not choose to launch an ambush in the dense forest of the northern mountain road. Nor did they choose to attack at night. Instead, they chose to attack in the evening when the caravan had just arrived at the entrance of the northern mountain road. Even though Ninkei had a natural intuition for danger since childhood, he still did not think of this. Dusk was the time when people were most likely to relax and their guard was at its lowest. Moreover, the convoy was about to meet the Gushan Commandery's reinforcement team, so it was inevitable that people would relax a little. These enemies must be taking advantage of this. Vaguely, he saw many figures appearing in the dense forest on both sides of the northern mountain road. Based on the previous calculation of the density of arrows and what he could see, he roughly estimated the number of enemies to be about 60. After all, they were in the territory of the Tang Empire, and the enemy wanted to assassinate His Majesty's favorite fourth princess. Whether for the sake of secrecy before or after the assassination, the enemy could not use a real large force, so they could only choose the most loyal men of sacrifice. Since they were men of sacrifice, The number of them naturally could not be too large. However, Ninkei was very clear that in a fight on the battlefield, the more people there were, the more powerful they would be. On the contrary, a team composed of all fearless men of sacrifice was the most difficult to deal with. The bigwigs of the empire arranged such a shocking assassination. In addition to men of sacrifice, they might even ask cultivators to help. Thinking that he might see the battle between those powerhouses on the battlefield today, Ninkei inexplicably felt a kind of inexplicable excitement in his heart, and then he felt an unprecedented fear. "How unlucky I am," he muttered as he turned around to glance at the maidservant beside him. He noticed that besides the panic and bewilderment that had appeared in her eyes in the beginning, the young lady had actually swiftly calmed down, and he couldn't help but silently praise her in his heart. The enemies on both sides of the dense forest had already poured out. Those men in Grey Tang army uniforms did not cover their faces. They were waving the standard steel knives in their hands and pouncing forward at high speed like a pack of wolves. Since they did not hide their identities, it was obvious that one side would be completely slaughtered. The fierce barbarians around the convoy were the horse gang subdued by Her Highness on the grassland. They had long been stimulated by the previous arrow rain. Some of them raised their short bows and began to shoot rapidly, while others screamed and pulled out the machetes at their waists to meet the enemies. Suddenly, there was a fierce sound of blades colliding at the entrance of the northern mountain road. In the muffled groans and wild roars, people from both sides fell down from time to time. The tips of the blades stabbed into their chests and abdomens, and the blades cut open their throats. Blood sprayed from the men's bodies and dyed the already wet leaves red. As soon as the battle began, it entered the most tragic stage. But no one retreated or turned around to escape. In addition to killing skills, it was more about the valiant fighting spirit that dared to bleed. The grassland barbarians loyal to the princess were extremely good at archery. They were brave but not flustered. They suppressed the enemy's attack in an instant. Figures fell down from the dense forest from time to time. The barbarians screamed and counterattacked, gradually controlling the forest around the caravan formation. Although they were brave, they were still cautious and did not blindly expand their positions. From any point of view, the tactical choice of these grassland barbarian guards was very correct, at least in Ninkei's view. So he was very puzzled why the maidservant beside him became more and more solemn and gloomy, as if she was worried about something. After all, these brave grassland barbarians had never experienced the terrible battle in the Central Plains. Thinking about it with worry, she gritted her teeth and was ready to stand up. Ninkei would not let her expose herself and put himself and Sangsang in a terrible situation. He clenched his right hand into a fist and punched her knee, making her fall down again. "What are you doing?" The maidservant stared at his eyes angrily, while her right hand quietly and slowly reached to her waist. Ninkei looked at the battlefield attentively and did not pay attention to her question. When he noticed the scene in the caravan formation, he thought of a possibility and could not help but feel slightly cold. The battle at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road was fierce, but there was a strange silence in the caravan formation. The dozen elite Tang bodyguards, who should have been sent to the grassland as a dowry, were like a dozen stone statues, half kneeling around the two carriages. In front of one of the carriages, the gentle old man in an old robe was sitting with his eyes closed. Under the protection of the bodyguards, he was facing the dark and dense forest. Ninkei nervously licked his numb lips and stretched out his hand to Sangsang. His palm was wet with sweat. Sangsang glanced at him and handed over the bow and arrow in her hand. Then she slowly and silently untied the black umbrella on her back and quietly put it on the fallen leaves beside her. The battle was still going on. The three of them were separated from the fierce battlefield by the caravan formation. It seemed that the battle between the grassland barbarians and the men of sacrifice would not affect them in a short time. But somehow, Ninkei felt unprecedentedly nervous, and the sweat between his palm and the bowstring had gradually dried up. The dozen bodyguards beside the carriages, half kneeling on the ground like stone statues, looked coldly at the depths of the dense forest. Their slightly dark faces were full of firmness and calmness. Although they were vigilant, they were absolutely fearless. These Tang bodyguards were from the Yulin royal guards of Chang, and were specially selected to accompany the fourth princess to the grassland. They were naturally the most elite members of the military. But today, in the battle outside the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, their performance was somewhat strange. When the rain of arrows came from the depths of the dark forest, they quickly formed a circular defensive formation and silently hid behind their shields. When the enemy men of sacrifice came, they still remained motionless and maintained this posture, completely ignoring the fierce battle taking place around them. From time to time, the grassland barbarians of the same camp died in front of them, and from time to time, a lifeless body hit the caravan formation with a dull thud. They did not even blink their eyelashes and just stared coldly at the depths of the dense forest, their hearts and bodies as hard as steel. The bodyguards knelt on one knee on the fallen leaves. They wore cotton shirts, and the edges of the cotton shirts could vaguely see the armor pieces. Their right hands reached behind their backs and tightly grasped the slanted hilts. They stared coldly ahead and surrounded the two carriages behind them. One carriage was gorgeous and silent. In front of the other carriage, the only old man in the team was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed. He looked very relaxed, with a sword across his knees. The scabbard was old and tattered, just like the old man's robe. The bodyguards guarded around the old man expressionlessly, as if they could not see the battle around them and could not hear the shouts. Occasionally, when the enemy was about to break into their defensive circle, a bodyguard would pull out his sword and throw himself into the battle. Because he was outnumbered, the single bodyguard would quickly fall into a bloody battle. But even so, the rest of the bodyguards were not moved. They did not even blink their eyelashes and still refused to leave the old man. Ning Ke did not know why the bodyguards were like this, nor did he know what was hidden in the leaves of the dark forest that the bodyguards were vigilantly watching. But he knew that there must be a great horror there. He vaguely guessed what was going to happen. The gorgeous and cold new world was about to open the curtain, and the reality that was about to come made him extremely nervous. His scalp was a little numb, and his index and middle fingers kept silently stroking the bowstring. After a while, his breathing magically slowed down, and his expression became calmer and more composed than before. The fear of waiting for the unknown danger made the atmosphere extremely depressing. The fierce fighting around the caravan formation and the sound of swords colliding seemed to have disappeared. At the most tense and critical moment, the window of the gorgeous carriage was pushed open with a squeak. A beautiful young woman poked her head out. Her hair was slightly in a bun, and she looked slightly worried. Before she could say anything, the cold-looking bodyguard beside the carriage whispered to Her Highness to be careful. Then he quickly reached out and closed the window, blocking her back. Although his expression was respectful, perhaps because of the tense situation, his actions were a little rude. Chapter 11. The Sacrifice of the Bigwigs. Looking at this scene, Ning Ke thought silently in his heart. But he felt two cold eyes beside him. He turned his head and found that Sang Sang was looking at him quietly with her face tilted. They stared at each other for 1 or 2 seconds. Usually it was a short time, but now it was a long time. Ning Ke was defeated by his little handmaiden once again in his life. He sighed helplessly in his heart and tightened his leg muscles. He inserted his toes into the thick leaves and slightly wet soil, ready to exert his strength at any time. In the distance, in the depths of the northern mountain road, which was getting darker and darker because of the setting sun, a sudden gust of wind came among the gray-black branches. The new shoots on the branches were hidden under the protection of the old bark and were not hurt. But the leaves on the ground that had accumulated for many years were blown into the air, rustled, and then fell one after another. In spring the boundless fallen trees rustled. A burly man in a dark light armor appeared in the depths of the northern mountain road. With a thunderous roar, a faint earthy light seeped out of his light armor and flashed away, as if a god had occasionally glanced at him from the clouds. His two arms that were as thick as trees suddenly rose up, turning a piece of heavy stone he picked up from who knows where into a roaring stone bullet, fiercely smashing towards that gorgeous carriage. What a terrifying power that could turn a man into a long-range catapult! The heavy stone whistled through the air at a high speed, smashing any twigs on its way. Along an arc, it unstoppably crossed a distance of hundreds of meters and accurately and coldly hit the first carriage. With a muffled bang, the luxuriously decorated carriage with a solid internal structure was suddenly scattered into a pile of broken firewood and rags. Inside the carriage, there was a faint trace of blood and broken limbs. The Tang bodyguards who had been kneeling on one knee outside the carriage still looked indifferent, as if they did not see that the carriage behind them had been turned into rubbish and that the princess, whom they had sworn to protect, had been smashed into pieces. There was not even a look of surprise on their faces. Instead, there was a faint sense of relief and calmness on their faces. "Frontline, shoot!" the bodyguard leader shouted in a low voice. The three subordinates remained in a half-kneeling position. Their right hands had already let go of the hilt of their swords. They held the powerful military crossbow horizontally, aimed at the depths of the forest, and quickly pulled the trigger. 9 crossbow bolts shot through the slowly fluttering fallen leaves like lightning, accurately hitting that heavenly deity like large man's body. However, that tall and sturdy large man only waved his hand, brushing away the 2 crossbow bolts that were aimed at his face, completely ignoring the crossbow bolt that hit his chest. The man's stone-like palms were numbed by the high-speed crossbow bolt. The crossbow bolt in his chest was stuck in his light armor. It trembled twice like an unsteady long-legged insect before falling to the ground. There was a faint bloodstain on the tip of the bolt. It was probably only a minor injury. Because of the long distance, this wave of crossbow bolts had no effect except for the above-mentioned effect. The bodyguard leader had been mentally prepared for this, and his expression did not change at all. Looking at the tall figure standing in the depths of the northern mountain road, he raised his right hand and shouted, "Wait!" The 3 guards put down their bows and gripped the hilts of their swords in their right hands again. Because of Sang Sang, Ning Ke had planned to find a chance to rescue the poor scapegoat in the carriage. However, the situation changed so fast that he had no time to react. The huge man appeared in front of them, and the heavy stone flew from the sky, turning the gorgeous carriage and the woman in it into a bloody powder. Did he sympathize with the nameless woman, or did he feel ashamed of the little handmaiden's trust as the master? Anyway, his eyes fell on the depths of the northern mountain road, and his face was a little pale. By using some kind of secret cultivation technique, the giant man possessed such violent and incredible power. However, throwing the boulder that weighed more than 1,000 kilograms over such a long distance still made him pay a great price. His face was flushed, and sweat was gushing out of the arrow holes on his light armor. His legs were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be showing signs of exhaustion. For some unknown reason, in the face of such a good opportunity, the dozen indifferent bodyguards did not choose to attack, but still guarded around the second carriage vigilantly. The old man in an old robe sat in the carriage, his eyes still closed. Suddenly, the old man's grizzled hair started to move, flowing on his dirty old robe like a silver stream. The old sword on his knees started to hum, and the body of the sword in its sheath kept bumping against the inner wall, as if it couldn't wait to come out and drink blood. Wung wung wung. Clang! A clear sound rang out. The bright dagger flew out of its sheath and crossed itself beside the old man's knees. It turned into a streak of cyan sword light, rolling up the leaves and splitting the wind. It pierced into the depths of the northern mountain road silently, as if it was going to pierce through that godlike giant body. There seemed to be an invisible mirror between the twilight at the entrance of the northern mountain road and the gloomy jungle. When the bright dagger flew out of the old man's knees and turned into a flowing light, a gray shadow of a sword was seen whizzing over from the jungle. The gray shadow was as fast as lightning. One moment it was still among the falling leaves, and the next moment it came to the battlefield at the entrance of the northern mountain road. The low buzzing sound at the beginning turned into a thunderous roar in the blink of an eye. The speed of the gray shadow was extremely fast, and the power it carried directly shattered all the leaves within a few feet of it. The silk-like broken leaves formed a straight line behind the shadow, and the end of the line was none other than the old man who no longer had a sword on his knees. Great Swordmaster! Looking at the gray shadow that had already become a thunderous roar, the bodyguards who had been waiting calmly like stone statues finally changed their expressions, and someone shouted a warning. When the most powerful old man on their side took action, the old sword on his knees pointed at the giant man in the depths of the jungle. The most powerful enemy, who had been hiding until now, finally showed up. As soon as he showed up, the wind and thunder roared. In order to assassinate Her Royal Highness in the territory of the Empire, the enemy sent 2 practitioners with extraordinary power, and even a great sword master. This fact made people shudder. However, there was still no fear on the faces of the bodyguards, only determination. The head of the bodyguard shouted, "Kill!" A series of densely packed sounds of blades being unsheathed rang out. Dozens of sharp steel blades, accompanied by the sound of the guards exerting their full strength, slashed towards the empty space in front of them. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. Swish. Every saber light was so fierce and tyrannical that it cut through the air and the imaginary hills, forming a dense net of sabers, tightly protecting the old man without the sword on his knees. The gray shadow that was shuttling at high speed swept to the front of the saber formation. Just as it was about to be chopped down by those sharp saber moves, it suddenly made a strange pause in midair. Then it made a turn to the side and miraculously avoided the direction of the saber formation, flying away with a whoosh. At the moment when it appeared in the dense forest of Northern Mountain Road, it had already become a thunderous roar, which seemed unstoppable. However, no one had expected that when it came to the real battle, the gray shadow would be so agile and strange. At the moment when the gray shadow turned, its speed dropped sharply. Finally, its body could be vaguely seen. It was like a very thin and dim sword shadow, which seemed to be blown away by a gust of wind. This sword shadow was as thin as a cicada's wing, as hard as a piece of paper. Its trajectory was unpredictable, and it was as agile as a ghost. As it turned and flew away with a swish, it flew close to the edge of a bodyguard's saber, and then brushed his lower jaw, leaving a faint trace of blood. The next moment, the faint trace of blood spread rapidly, and blood spurted out. The bodyguard held the saber in his right hand, and covered his neck with his left hand. Blood gushed out from his fingers. He stared at the depths of the forest with his eyes wide open, and then slowly fell forward. Until the moment of his death, he still didn't see the powerful sword master. The gray sword shadow drew a perfect arc in the air and once again shot back to the front of the saber formation like lightning. It was suddenly in front and suddenly behind. Its trajectory was unpredictable and impossible to capture. In the blink of an eye, 2 more guards were killed. Drops of blood slowly fell in the air. The bodyguard leader's expression was cold and calm. He held the slim hilt of the saber tightly with both hands, and stared at the gray sword shadow. Suddenly, he stepped forward with his left foot, and abruptly exerted strength from his waist and abdomen. The blade of the saber slanted down like a flash of lightning. At the same time he shouted, "Close!" With this command, the 4 guards in front and behind him, who had been waiting for an opportunity for a long time, brandished their steel sabers like snowflakes, forcing the faint gray sword shadow into a narrow space. That space was immediately shattered by the slanted saber strike of the leader of the guards, who concentrated all his energy, chi, and spirit. The gray sword shadow moved so fast that it was about to be cut by the saber, but it forcibly stopped in a very small space. The bodyguard leader was prepared for this. With a muffled groan, he held the end of the long hilt with his left hand and pressed it down. The slanted saber was raised like a flash of lightning, and hit the gray sword shadow. With a slight muffled sound, the agile gray sword shadow fell to the dust like a thin snake that had been hit in the heart, and fell into the thick layer of rotten leaves and mud. This was the first time that the Tang bodyguard's saber formation had hit the sword shadow of an enemy great sword master. However, no one cheered. To be exact, there was no time to cheer. Because the dead leaves on the ground began to shake violently, like a giant snake that had just woken up, and quickly slithered under the feet of the bodyguards. The dead leaves flew and the wet mud splashed. The gray sword shadow shot up like a flash of lightning, and easily cut through the cotton armor of a bodyguard's thigh, and cut through the main artery that was fatal. Muffled groans sounded in the saber formation from time to time. The bodyguards fell down one after another. Occasionally they could hit the gray sword shadow, but they could never completely cut it into a dead object. The bodyguard leader's expression gradually became sad and indignant. In the depressing and tragic atmosphere, he took another step forward, held the long hilt with both hands, and slashed again with a roar. "Close!" he shouted sternly. The last surviving bodyguards shouted in unison, and rushed to the gray shadow desperately, setting up the last barrier with their bodies and the saber radiance in their hands. With two soft sounds, the bodies of two bodyguards fell to the ground without any signs of life. The bodyguard leader's earlobe was neatly cut in half, and blood dripped down. There were a few more bloody wounds on his body, like someone's wild drunkenness. This was the 7th time the gray sword shadow was struck by the guard's blades. Its speed was much slower than it was at the beginning, but it was not struck down in the end. It flew slowly with a buzzing sound, broke through the blade formation, and arrived in front of the old man in the old robe. At this time, people finally saw the gray sword shadow clearly. It was a small sword without a handle, and the dim sword body was extremely thin, without a trace of blood. The bodyguard leader, who was covered in blood, knelt on one knee with his saber. He lowered his head and gritted his teeth, thinking unwillingly, "Just one more cut, just one more cut, and I and my brothers can complete this seemingly impossible task." However, a great swordmaster is a great swordmaster after all. The seemingly long process of the battle was actually just the time it took for the wind of the saber to become sharp, the shadow of the sword to float a few times, and the blood to spray a few times. During this process, the old man sitting in the carriage kept his eyes closed ever since the sword flew away from his knees, as if he did not know that he was in great danger. No one noticed that the old man's hands, which were gently hanging on his knees, were trembling slightly. His thumbs quickly pressed the two horizontal lines on his middle and index fingers, like a dragonfly skimming the water. It seemed that he was doing some kind of extremely complicated calculation. Just when the hiltless small sword flew in front of him, and was less than a foot away from his eyebrows, the old man finally opened his eyes and looked over. At first glance, the hiltless small sword was suspended in the air, as if it was frozen and could not move at all. In the depths of the dense forest, the giant man, who was almost forgotten by people, looked at the bright flying sword in his wide palm, which had been crushed into copper and iron. He was stunned and finally guessed what was going on. He raised his head and shouted in panic, "He is not a sword master. He is a psyche master." Chapter 12. As if it understood the roar of the giant man and understood that it had fallen into a trap, the dull and matte hiltless sword began to tremble violently in the air, causing the air around it to emit a buzzing sound. It was like a bird that was darting left and right trying to escape. The old man put his hands on his knees, looking at the hiltless sword less than a foot away from his eyebrows. His eyes were as soft as silk. However, these silk strands contained a terrible power, tightly binding the escaping hiltless sword, making it impossible for it to move. The temperature of the place where the old man's eyes met dropped sharply, and the hiltless sword was instantly covered with a thin layer of frost. It struggled more and more violently, buzzing, but it could not break free. This futile struggle lasted for a long time, and finally the hiltless sword fell on the leaves with a sad cry, as if it had lost its life. At the same time, somewhere in the dense forest of Northern Mountain Road, Behind a tree not far from the carriages, a painful muffled groan was heard. The old man's calm eyes flashed with a sense of relief. With his hands on his knees, his skinny body suddenly bounced up from the side of the carriage, as if blown by a strong wind, and suddenly drifted to the depths of the dense forest of Northern Mountain Road, floating in front of the giant man. The giant man roared. His palm, which was as big as a cattail leaf fan, fiercely struck down from above. It was as if a small mountain was pressing down on the old man's skinny body. It was as if the palm would easily turn the old man into a pile of flesh and blood in the next moment. The old man expressionlessly looked at the approaching palm, opened his dry lips slightly, and uttered a silent word. Then he crossed his muddy hands in front of him and made a mudra. As the silent word came out of his mouth and his hands overlapped into a mudra, the dirty old robe on the old man suddenly became extremely hard, and every wrinkle was flattened. It seemed that he was not wearing a robe, but the robe was supporting his skinny body. The wind of the palm came to an abrupt stop, trembling over the top of the old man's head, but there was no way to hit him. The movements of the other parts of the giant man's body also became extremely slow and stiff. Blood began to drip from the corners of his eyes, and his jaw kept trembling. He seemed to be in extreme pain. The old man's face was very pale, and he seemed to be struggling. He struggled to raise his right arm to the chest of the giant man, but his movement was extremely slow. At this moment, the giant man seemed to be controlled by some strange power. He could only watch as the old man's palm approached him inch by inch, but he couldn't do anything to stop the old man. The old man's palm silently pressed against the giant man's chest. A strong wind blew out from the palm and the giant man's chest. With a muffled cracking sound, the giant man's rock-like chest suddenly collapsed. Borrowing the wind from his palms, the old man shrunk his body and retreated quickly. The wind rustled the corner of his robe and made a whistling sound. In an instant, he retreated to the side of the carriage and sat down cross-legged. In the blink of an eye, the old man returned. His hands rested lightly on his knees, and his robe became wrinkled and dirty again, as if he had never moved at all. The giant man in the depths of the dense forest of Northern Mountain Road finally regained control of his body. His palm, which he had been unable to strike, smashed a big hole in the ground. However, it was too late. Looking at the bloody hole in his chest, he let out a roar of unwillingness and despair, and collapsed like a mountain. The old man sitting cross-legged next to the carriage glanced at that place and began to cough violently, and even some red blood was coughed up on his robe. The guards set up a saber formation and risked their lives to fight against the hiltless small sword, which earned them precious time. During this time, the old man calculated and captured the hiding position of the great sword master. Then, using the hiltless small sword as a bridge, he used his psyche power to directly injure the enemy through the air. Completing this blow consumed a lot of his mind and spirit. Then, he floated to the Northern Mountain Road and killed the giant man with his palm. It seemed very easy, but in fact it was a very risky move. The psyche power in the ocean of chi and mountain of snow was gone, and his body became extremely weak. Fortunately, the outcome had been determined. The battle at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road had ended. The grassland horse gangs who followed Her Highness had proved their loyalty, courage, and strong fighting capacity in the battle. They also paid a great price for killing all the enemy men of sacrifice with their slightly curved sabers. Those who were lucky enough to survive were bathed in blood, and had long been unable to stand. The number of surviving guards who could stand up was even fewer. The old man looked at the tree not far from him with a complicated expression. As the night fell, it was quiet at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. The bark of the big tree peeled off piece by piece, like a person rapidly aging in a very short time. Ominous spots appeared, and the body showed signs of decay and collapse. A middle-aged scholar in a cyan gown slowly walked out from behind the big tree, with an empty round scabbard on his shoulder. He looked handsome. Although he was a little older, he could be called elegant if he was in the brothel of Chang, and, unfortunately, his current appearance could not be considered elegant. Countless tiny beads of blood seeped out of the pores on his face and hands, turning him into a horrifying bloody man. Some parts of his green robe were also soaked in blood. It seemed that his body, which was covered by his robe, was also covered in those tiny beads of blood, just like his exposed face and hands. The middle-aged scholar raised his sleeves to wipe the blood and sweat on his eyebrows. He looked at the old man beside the carriage and the empty scabbard beside the old man, and sighed with a low voice, "One wrong move leads to many wrong moves." Liu Qingchen, the minister of offerings of the South School of Haotian Taoism, actually abandoned the sword and cultivated the psyche. If this news was spread out, I don't know how many people would be shocked. After a short silence, he sighed with emotion. What's more unexpected is that you can actually enter the see-through state at such an old age. Is there any secret method of Haotian Taoism? The old man's name was Liu Qingchen. He answered softly, I followed Her Highness to the north for a year. I saw some different scenery and people on the grassland. I was touched, so my state improved. It has nothing to do with our Taoism. Hearing this unexpected explanation, the middle-aged scholar was stunned for a moment. He seemed to understand something and kept silent for a long time. Then he looked at the guard leader who was kneeling on one knee among the fallen leaves with a saber, and said in a very serious tone, Since I entered the great sword master state, I have always thought that the secular force could not compete with me. Today you and your subordinates have taught me a lesson. The middle-aged scholar cupped his hands to salute the guards who were seriously injured among the fallen leaves, and praised, brave and fearless soldiers like you are the pride of our Tang Empire. The guard leader slightly bowed and did not say anything. There are not many great sword masters in Chang'an, but I don't know you. The old man Liu Qingchen looked at the middle-aged scholar who was covered with blood and said, The academy is really a place of hidden talents. Hearing the word academy, the people who survived in the forest at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road could not help but feel confused and shocked. Could it be that the assassination against Her Highness had something to do with the high status of the academy? Ning Ke subconsciously looked at the maidservant beside him, and saw that she had a thoughtful expression on her face. Obviously, she did not believe this statement. The middle-aged scholar was stunned for a moment, and then he shook his head and said sadly, I didn't expect that you could see through my background. But as an unworthy junior, I dare not bring shame to the academy. I'm just a stupid student who was expelled from the academy. He was covered with blood, and his body was shaking, as if he could fall at any time. However, facing such an enemy, the grassland barbarians and guards who survived in the carriages were very nervous, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Ning Ke was also very nervous, but he was more excited and helpless. He had lived in the city of Wei for many years, studied the article on the response of the Tao for many years, and imagined these powerhouses through the rumors in the market for many years. Today's battle at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road was the first time in his life that he had witnessed a real battle between powerhouses. He had heard that those valiant generals of the Tang Empire also had their own tyrannical means. However, the border had been peaceful for many years, and as a small soldier in a border town, he had no chance to see such a battle on the battlefield. The hiltless small sword flew among the falling leaves, the strength to pull up a mountain, the power to throw stones and break chariots, the power of psyche power between eyes closed, and the power to hurt people from a distance. These extremely incredible and magical aspects happened one after another in a very short period of time, making his mind shake and unable to calm down. The academy expelled stupid student. These 3 words entered his ears, calmed him down a little, but immediately made his scalp tingle. A stupid student who was expelled from the academy could kill nearly 10 of the most elite guards of the Tang Empire with a dull hiltless small sword. Then what kind of incredible power did the real students of the academy have? They should be Xiaoho's people. The maidservant beside him said coldly in a low voice. Hearing the 2 words Xiaoho, Ning Ke's expression slightly froze, and his body became a little stiff. After a few seconds, he returned to normal, But his eyes had changed from the previous admiration to cold judgment and calculation. "You are cultivating Howren's sword, so it is not difficult to guess that you are from the academy," Liu Qingchen said. "But it seems a pity that you did not learn more in the second floor before being expelled from the academy. At the beginning, your sword already had the power of wind and thunder, but you forcibly changed it to the state of quickness and mysteriousness. The most important thing in the Great Spirit is to be upright and unhindered. You have taken the wrong path, and this choice is really despicable. If you met me 20 years ago when I was in my prime, even if I did not enter the see-through state, you could not be my opponent." The middle-aged scholar bowed his head and smiled slightly, and the smile on his handsome face full of tiny blood beads looked particularly gloomy. As a great sword master who had entered the see-through state, this middle-aged scholar in a turquoise robe was invited to assassinate Her Highness. After knowing the strength of the old man beside the princess, he thought it was a very easy thing to do. However, the party who provided him intelligence did not know that the old man beside the princess had entered the see-through state on the grassland. What was more shocking was that the wayfarer of the South School of Haotian Taoism actually chose to abandon the sword and follow the psyche state. Even so, he would not be completely powerless tonight, but this great sword master did not expect that the Tang bodyguards beside the carriage could cause him so much trouble, so that Liu Qingchen could calculate his position. It was a very dangerous thing to be calculated by a powerhouse of the same state, especially a psyche master. Liu Qingchen first controlled the shadow of his sword, and then used the hiltless small sword as a bridge to hurt each other with his psyche state. Facing the psyche master who was the fastest to kill, he had no way to deal with it. His psyche power directly attacked his ocean of consciousness and mountain of snow, causing his internal organs to crack and blood to flow. Today he was destined to die at the entrance of the northern mountain road, so he did not care about the comments of the old man Liu Qingchen. However, even if he died, there were some things that he had to accomplish. Chapter 13. After Liu Qingchen finished his words, he started to cough violently again. Psychic masters were the most mysterious in the imagination of ordinary people. Only they themselves knew that the seemingly magical psychic power was actually a double-edged sword. While it killed and injured the enemy, it would also cause great damage to the psychic master's sea of consciousness and even his body. He glanced at the hill-like corpse of the giant man in the distance and thought that the Empire's precious resources of experts would be reduced by 2 people after this battle. He couldn't help but feel extremely regretful, and even felt a kind of pity for his nephew. He shook his head and sighed. Although there are many powerhouses in the Tang Empire, there are not many who have reached the state of great sword master. Since you are from the academy, you should be serving the country. How can you be a traitor? Traitor? What is a traitor? Mr. Qingchen, since you are from Haotian Taoism, then you should know the comment of the imperial astronomer that was erased. The night covers the stars, the country will not be peaceful. The middle-aged scholar had already confirmed from the expressions of the bodyguards that the assassination target was not in the carriage, and the dead woman was just a cover. He glanced at the gorgeous carriage that had become a pile of rubbish and sneered. I don't care what General Xiahou thinks. I only know that he and I have the same goal, which is to kill the demoness in your team. Liu Qingchen thought of the uproar of the imperial astronomer more than 10 years ago. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, The spirit of the academy is not about the outside world. I am from Haotian Taoism and I don't believe in these supernatural things. Why do you have to do this? I have followed Her Highness for more than 4 years and never thought that she was the one who answered the omens. After hearing these secrets that the lower class of the empire would never know, Ning Ke vaguely understood why Her Highness insisted on marrying into the grassland and why His Majesty, who loved her so much, agreed in the end. Thinking of this, He could not help but turn his head to look beside him. He saw that the pretty maidservant's expression had become extremely ugly and her eyes were filled with frost. The middle-aged scholar slowly hid all the emotions on his face and no longer answered Liu Qingchen. Instead, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. As he breathed, the leaves around him began to roll and his cyan robe fluttered in the wind. "What else do you want to do?" Liu Qingchen looked at him with a frown and said, "I've waited for you for 77 breaths, but you still haven't managed to adjust your qi circulation. This proves that your internal organs are broken, your sea of qi is destroyed, and your natal sword is destroyed. Now you're even worse than an ordinary soldier." Don't tell me you still don't want to be at peace even at this moment? In the eyes of ordinary people, cultivators who could mobilize the qi of heaven and earth, no matter if they were sword masters or psyche masters, were very mysterious people. Some foolish villagers even believed that the most powerful cultivators could reincarnate. Therefore, even though the middle-aged scholar was at the end of his life, the grassland barbarians and guards who were seriously injured did not dare to relax and were very vigilant. It was not until they heard Liu Qingchen's words that they finally believed that the terrible great sword master could not hold on any longer. Fatigue and injuries began to invade their minds and bodies. Only Ning Ke was still vigilant. Since the beginning of the battle, he had been hiding in the leaves like a quail. He stared at the middle-aged scholar who was bathed in blood beside the big tree, holding the bow and arrow and moving his body inch by inch, looking for the best position to shoot. In the Tang Empire, honor was more important than life. Whether it was the scholar officials or the common people, they all especially respected the demeanor. In their eyes, when the enemy was fighting hard and was about to die, he should be respected according to his strength and identity. At this moment, the one who was about to die was a respected great sword master, so the guard leader nodded his head to salute him, even if he had killed many of his loyal subordinates. Therefore, Liu Qingchen would talk to him and let him finish his last words. Ning Ke had never been a typical Tang person. He valued honor, but it was nonsense to insist that honor was his life. He did not think that there was anything more important than life in the world, and even if there was, it would not be honor. He was just a small soldier in the border town, and did not understand the fighting style of these powerful cultivators at all. Today was the first time he had seen such a battle. But today, since the great sword master had become his enemy, he would always be vigilant and ready to kill him by any means at any time. Ever since he was a child, he had been living a tough life, fighting against the barbarians in the frontier fortress for several years. This made the teenager develop a deep-rooted understanding. Only a dead enemy is a safe enemy, a good enemy. Only then would he take off his military cap and stare at the enemy's corpse to show his utmost respect. Right at this moment, an unexpected change occurred. Or it could be said that it happened just as he had expected. The leaves were dancing rapidly beside the big tree, and the middle-aged scholar's green robe, which was soaked in blood, suddenly expanded rapidly, and several streams of blood gushed out from his 5 orifices, as if a horrible invisible force was pouring into his body from the leaves, from the heaven and the earth, forcing all his strength and blood out. Take in the heaven and the earth. Seeing this scene, Liu Qingchen suddenly changed his expression, and looked at the middle-aged scholar angrily and scolded. People from the academy use the methods of the devil's doctrine? How dare you betray your teacher? The battle at the entrance of the northern mountain road was extremely dangerous and tragic, but the old man was not moved from the beginning to the end. In the eyes of the Tangs, since there were already 2 camps of enemies, it was normal to win or lose, and it did not involve the so-called morality and justice. But when he found that the middle-aged scholar used the self-destruction method of the devil's doctrine, he finally could not help but be angry for the first time. If you are on the right path, you don't need to fear the devil's doctrine. The middle-aged scholar slowly raised his right arm, pointing at the old man beside the carriage, and said indifferently, "If this is the oblivion, then let me sink into the underworld, and never be reincarnated." As soon as he finished speaking, A deep blood mark suddenly appeared at the base of his right index finger, and the white bone could be vaguely seen. With a muffled groan, his index finger was pulled away from his palm, and suddenly sped up, turning into a blood shadow, rushing towards Liu Qingchen's face. Taking in the chi of heaven and earth in the body, at the risk of breaking his body, and turning his body into a flying sword, condensing all his skills into a strike, was the most typical method of the devil's doctrine. For the team escorting the princess, Liu Qingchen was their strongest support, especially at this time, when the grassland barbarians and guards had suffered heavy casualties, and almost no one had the strength to fight anymore. Therefore, the role of the old man was particularly important. If he died under this broken finger, who else could resist the critical strike of a great sword master before his death? Two grassland barbarians rushed towards the middle-aged scholar, howling madly, but before they could run 2 steps, they staggered and fell on the fallen leaves, and the machetes in their hands were also shaken out. The guard leader, who was half kneeling, suddenly fell to the ground, and struggled to crawl forward, dragging blood with him. Not far from him, there was a crossbow arrow left by a dead guard. Although he had tried his best, it was obvious that he was still too slow. When he grabbed the crossbow arrow, Liu Qingchen, who was too weak to fight anymore, had already been stabbed by the broken finger. In the dark forest at the entrance of the northern mountain road, no one had expected that a great sword master from the academy would use the method of the devil's doctrine. No one was prepared, and it seemed that they could only watch the great sword master successfully kill them, and then the whole team would die. Ning Ke was prepared. He had prepared for a long time. When the middle-aged scholar in Sion sighed indifferently, he was not moved at all, but vigilantly watched his every move, and slowly moved his body, looking for the best position. When the middle-aged scholar began to absorb the chi of heaven and earth into his body, and the fallen leaves in the forest danced wildly, Ning Ke had already stood between the dead leaves with one foot in front of the other, and raised the seemingly ordinary boxwood bow in his hand, aiming at the opponent. He exerted strength in his right arm, transferred the strength to his wrist, and suddenly pulled the bowstring like a full moon. The tough bowstring bearing a huge force made a buzzing sound, and the feather arrow on the bowstring slightly trembled, and then quickly became calm like a snake waiting to be ejected. When the middle-aged scholar's broken finger flew out, Ning Ke slightly loosened the middle and index fingers of his right hand, twisted the stabilizer on the bowstring, and the bowstring bounced back with a buzzing sound. An arrow shot out like lightning, piercing through several fallen leaves, and directly toward the middle-aged scholar's chest. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The bowstring vibrated rapidly, and the black feather arrow moved forward like lightning, piercing the fallen leaves and tearing the night sky. Just before the great sword master in Sion pierced the old man Liu Qingchen's face with the devil's doctrine's broken finger, the arrow had already reached his chest. The body of a cultivator was not stronger than that of an ordinary person, especially for a sword master, psyche master, and talisman master. Because they meditated for a long time, their bodies would become weaker, and they needed to pay special attention to close-range defense. In addition to the men of sacrifice like the bodyguards, they would generally wear light armor under their long cotton robes to prevent being attacked by assassins. At the last moment of his life, the great sword master from the academy did not hesitate to use the devil's doctrine's method to kill the enemy's most powerful psyche master. His determination could be seen, so when he sensed the enemy's sneak attack with a bow and arrow, he did not make any response. In his psyche and sense of perception, there was only the rippling lake formed by the chi of heaven and earth. The broken finger was like a black line breaking through the waves, moving forward with difficulty. At this moment he had to concentrate all his spiritual power to complete the last blow. He would not allow himself to be disturbed by anything, even the cold feather arrow that was about to hit his body. Moreover, under the Sion robe was a delicate soft armor. He believed that from such a long distance, the arrow that came from nowhere would not have the ability to kill him. With a muffled sound, an arrow pierced into his chest. The arrowhead was strangely rotating at a high speed, many times faster than ordinary arrows. The sharp tip instantly tore the Sion robe apart, and squeezed into the small gap of the light armor. The arrow pierced into his flesh, and blood started to appear. The middle-aged scholar still did not pay attention to it, and did not even look down. The tiny beads of blood on his face flowed into a stream, and his tightly furrowed eyebrows were written with sorrow. It was painful when the arrow pierced into his body, but he would not die. So what? But Ninkei had shot more than one arrow. Chapter 14. Swoosh. The second arrow came like lightning and hit the middle-aged scholar's chest with a frightening sound of flesh piercing. The place where the arrow disappeared was exactly the place where the first arrow broke through the indigo robe and soft armor. The third arrow came at the same time and hit the opening that was gradually expanding. There was no longer any obstruction before the arrow tip, and it pierced through the scholar's body. No one knew how Ninkei managed to shoot 3 arrows in a row with the seemingly ordinary boxwood bow in a very short period of time. No one could figure out why this seemingly ordinary young soldier had such horrifying archery skills that he could shoot the same small area 3 times in a row. The middle-aged scholar felt as if a hard and thick wooden stick had smashed into his chest, and he was forced to take 2 steps back. Then he felt a slight heat in his chest, and that heat eventually turned into a scalding heat. He looked down subconsciously and saw an arrow piercing through his chest. A small part of the arrow shaft and arrow feather were left outside his indigo robe. They were stained with blood and looked like a blooming red flower. The middle-aged scholar stared at the wet red flower on his indigo robe in disbelief. His face was full of blood and water, showing a ridiculous and shocked expression. He slowly fell onto the ground in the decayed leaves and mud. Even a cultivator, even one who absorbed the chi of heaven and earth into his body with the means of the devil's doctrine, would not be able to control his psyche after his heart was pierced through. The invisible thread between heaven and earth suddenly broke the moment he fell onto the ground. The blood-stained broken finger that had lost control could no longer threaten a psyche master, although the psyche master was extremely weak now. Liu Qingchen slightly raised his eyebrows and shook off the broken finger in front of him. The broken finger brushed past his aged face and landed on the carriage behind the old man. With a few crisp poochie sounds, half of the carriage collapsed and turned into rubble. The broken finger condensed a little bit of the chi of heaven and earth that the middle-aged scholar had absorbed previously. Although he had lost control of his psyche, it could still cause such a terrible effect. If it weren't for the 3 arrows, the broken finger would have caused severe damage to the old man, and the assassination would have ended differently. Those who had survived were all well aware of this point. The middle-aged scholar was naturally the one who understood the most. He painfully looked at the arrow in his chest and raised his head with difficulty. He wanted to see just what the archer looked like. He had shot 3 lightning-fast arrows at the most critical moment. He had used his invincible archery to break through the intricate light armor. He had killed a great swordsman almost unbelievably. He had turned the tide and saved the Tang Empire's princess from danger. Was it time to enjoy the shock, gratitude, and even worship from the crowd? Ninkei did not think so, and there was not a trace of a relieved smile on his face. He still held the boxwood bow in his hand tightly, with the arrow on the string pulled and aimed at the great sword master sitting under the tree. However, his ears were listening to the slight sounds above the forest. He was on guard. Xiaoho! Xiaoho! Xiaoho, when the maidservant told him that the great sword master should be Xiaoho's subordinate, and he had already admitted it, Ninkei had been silently repeating the name in his heart. Xiaoho was not called Xiaoho. His name was Xiaoho. As one of the 4 most powerful great generals of the Tang Empire, this man's kung fu was domineering and unparalleled. He had outstanding military exploits, and his character was extremely brave and ruthless. He had been stationed in the fierce Willow Camp with strict military law for many years and was famous for his arrogance and killing. His original surname was Xia, but he did not allow his children to be named Xia. Instead, he changed his full name to their surnames, such as the eldest son Xiahou Jing and the second son Xiahou Wei, and so on. When a scholar in the imperial court raised a question, Xiahou proudly replied, "I should create a surname that will be passed down for generations. I should be the ancestor, so my name should be the surname. It's for the Xiahou family." General Xiahou was a famous person, but Ning Ke had been silently repeating his name in his heart. From the description to the shock and then to the faint disappointment and mockery, it was naturally not because of this. Since he was 4 years old, this arrogant name, which seemed to be covered with blood, had been deeply hidden in his mind, and he had never forgotten it. He had never seen Xiahou, but he knew Xiahou's likes and dislikes, knew who Xiahou's favorite concubine was, knew why Xiahou cooked that concubine to death, knew that Xiahou ate 3 caddies of the fattest mutton every meal, and even knew when Xiahou went to the toilet every day. He believed that he was the one who knew this famous general of the Tang Empire best in the world, because he believed that no one in the world wanted to kill this famous general more than he did. The general's rough and overbearing appearance hid a cold, sharp and intelligent heart. It was a fact that he was cold, cruel and fond of killing, but this person would only ever believe in his own hands. Therefore, he would never place all of his ambitions to assassinate the princess in the hands of the middle-aged scholar, who was obviously not a direct descendant of the great sword master. That person would definitely send his most loyal men to watch the assassination and observe the development of the situation. He might even jump out at some critical moment to end everything. In Ning Ke's view, this was the best moment. Half of the carriage had collapsed, and the other half was intact. A little boy with a face full of dust poked his head out, crying. The pretty maidservant nervously lifted her skirt and ran to him. Ning Ke's right hand stretched out like lightning and threw her heavily to the ground. The twigs above their heads were broken into pieces, making a cracking sound, blurring people's eyes. Among the debris, 2 masked men in black appeared and threw 2 metal balls down. At the same time, they pulled out their long swords from their sheaths, and the coldness was piercing to the bone. The 2 metal balls were painted with red spots. They were kerosene bombs, which were only used in a small number by the Tang Empire's border army elites. Their burning power was extremely terrifying. Ning Ke had been in the military camp at the frontier fortress all year round, so he was naturally familiar with them. He threw away his bow and arrow as fast as he could and reached for the hilt on his back with both hands at the same time. He shouted, "Umbrella!" Chapter 15. It was the word umbrella. There was no verb before it. Ning Ke did not call out Song Song's name. The master and the handmaiden had lived together since they were children. They had been through hardships in the forest and grassland for several years, so they had a tacit understanding of each other. They only needed a look, a gesture, or a word to let each other know what they wanted to do. Just as the word umbrella was heard, Sang Sang quickly ran to the handmaiden like a little raccoon. She grasped the handle of the umbrella with both hands and pushed hard. The black umbrella, which was exaggeratedly huge compared to her thin body, suddenly opened. It was like a dark sky curtain appearing in the dense forest of Northern Mountain Road at night, blocking the stars. 2 kerosene bombs fell on the ground and quickly burned. The vigorous flame rolled up the leaves on the ground, and then the leaves made the fire more vigorous. Suddenly, it became a raging fire that could not be stopped. The guards and grassland barbarians who were still alive around the caravan looked at the fire rising into the sky and thought of the noble hiding there. They were so badly injured that they could not come to help. They could only watch the blazing fire wall engulfing everything there in an instant and let out desperate howls. However, they did not see that the big black umbrella was not burned. After the high temperature and blazing flames sprayed on the greasy surface of the black umbrella, it strangely became weak. What material was the surface of the black umbrella made of? It could block the stars like a black sky curtain, and it could also block the raging fire. Under the big black umbrella, the thin Sang Sang nervously lowered her head, closed her eyes and pursed her lips. Her 2 small hands tightly held the handle of the umbrella to resist the terrible flame close at hand. Her left hand holding the handle of the umbrella tightened for a while, and then loosened for a while. She looked extremely nervous and seemed to be struggling with something in her heart. The handmaiden was also under the black umbrella. Her slightly curled hair swayed between her pretty eyebrows. She was extremely nervous as she felt the heat of the umbrella, and looked at the sparks of fire through the black cloth umbrella. When her eyes followed the gap on the side of the black umbrella and saw the scene of the battle that was about to unfold, a touch of confusion and shock appeared in her eyes. The black-robed men hiding in the forest had been holding their breath for a long time. They silently observed the response of the princess's caravan, and judged the opponent's countermeasure. Finally, they determined where their assassination target was. Then they moved and successfully attracted the attention of Liu Qingchen with the help of the great swordmaster and the giant man, and quietly approached the place to launch an attack. The broken pieces of wood fell from the trees and the stars. The timing of the two men in black was very delicate and accurate. They shot 2 kerosene bombs at once and then quickly approached Ning Ke to kill him at close range. Ning Ke had no chance to use his magic archery skills. They were not powerful cultivators, but they were more professional assassins than those cultivators. The 2 black-robed assassins jumped down from the sky. Ning Ke's expression did not change much, nor did he panic. He threw away the bow and arrow in his hand like throwing away a worn-out shoe, and then suddenly jumped up when the 2 kerosene bombs hit the fallen leaves. The muscles of his waist, abdomen, and legs suddenly tightened and released, and his legs seemed to be equipped with some kind of spring. Without running or getting up, he suddenly jumped up from where he was. At this time, the kerosene bombs just started to burn. His figure was on the wall of fire, and it looked like he was stepping on the fiery tongue and floating with the help of the fire. He forcibly passed through the raging fire in the air. His hands clenched into hollow fists and naturally swayed from the side of his face to the back of his body. His legs slanted backward, and his body leaned forward. His movements seemed to be very natural and coordinated, like a beautiful bird gliding. The hilt of the cutlass on his back was about to be inserted into his hollow fists. When Ning Ke jumped over the wall of fire and floated in the air, he always stared at the 2 black-robed assassins. There were no distractions in his eyes, and he was focused and calm to the extreme, which made him look very calm. The black maidservant watched him jump over the wall of fire through the tiny gap under the black umbrella. She saw the calm expression on the lad's face under the firelight, and somehow felt very cold all over. At this moment, she remembered the scene she saw when she was hunting with Chan Yu on the grassland half a year ago. At that time, the young tiger jumped over the bushes and pounced on her. Its front paws were slightly clenched, and its hind legs were light and agile. There was no cruel or bloody expression in its eyes, but it was very calm and focused. In that split second, it actually had a kind of calm and even graceful temperament. However, the fierce tiger's eyes were the most terrifying eyes she had ever seen in her life. Sometimes, she would even be awakened by the calm tiger's eyes in her sleep at midnight. Calmness without emotion represented strength and confidence, and concentration represented willpower and determination. When a fierce tiger hunts its prey, it is focused and calm, but not cruel. Because tearing all the enemies into pieces was not because it wanted to vent its anger, but because it was its natural instinct to survive. It was just that it was used to knowing that it was good at what it was good at. In the firelight, the maidservant looked at Ning Ke's face and thought so. The assassins who had been killing in the dark all their lives were most sensitive to danger. Even the maidservant could feel the hidden danger under Ning Ke's calm and focused expression. When the 2 black-robed assassins stared at the lad who jumped over the wall of fire, they subconsciously felt nervous, even more nervous than when they assassinated the Yen army. Their hands holding the long swords were inexplicably stiff. In the whistling wind, Ning Ke jumped between the 2 assassins. The corner of his cotton robe was burned, leaving several faint lines of fire in the dense forest at night. 2 rusty long knives were pulled out from behind his shoulders at lightning speed and swung over like a storm. A series of extremely ear-piercing sounds of metal blades colliding suddenly rang out in the forest. Where the strong wind blew, The weak line of fire brought about by the burning cotton robe was blown into even finer sparks, but it illuminated the battlefield even brighter than before. When the knives and swords collided, Ninkei's body bounced forward and his feet took several steps on the fallen leaves. He forcibly inserted himself between the two assassins in black. He turned his wrist and turned his knife to drag, slashing diagonally along the back of the opponent's sword. He did not give the opponent any chance to change his move. Instead, he suppressed his opponent's momentum and slashed into the opponent's ribs. The heavy blades cut through the two assassins' sternum from the bottom and cut into their chests. Blood and flesh were squeezed out of the blades. The two assassins howled miserably. At the moment of death, they abandoned their swords and used their hands to trap Ninkei's blades with their own bodies, using the strong willpower of the Tang soldiers. At this moment, another assassin in black fell like a ghost. The short knife in his hands was bright, and he slashed at the back of Ninkei's neck. There was a third assassin in the forest. No matter how one looked at it, the two assassins should be making their last attempt. Unexpectedly, they still had a backup plan. This method seemed redundant, but in fact, it was full of ruthlessness at the expense of the lives of their companions and their own withered leaves. No one could have expected such a situation, except for Ninkei himself and the little handmaiden under the black umbrella. 6-2. The little handmaiden under the black umbrella nervously shrank her body. Just when the third assassin slashed at Ninkei, she closed her eyes tightly and used all her strength to shout two words. Two simple numbers. What could they remind Ninkei of? Was it a code word or a direction indication? But she obviously could not see the assassin, or even if she could accurately determine the position of the assassin, Ninkei's two knives were still in the chest cavity of the previous two assassins and their blood-stained hands. What could he do at this time? 6-2? That's really high. Hearing Song Song's anxious shout, Ninkei silently complained in his heart. Then he unhesitatingly loosened his hands, letting the two assassins in black, who were about to die, tightly hold his two knives with their lives in hands. Then he raised his empty hands high above his head. In the dimming firelight and the darkening night, he grasped the hard hilt wrapped in blood-sucking cotton and suddenly pulled out the last knife on his back. Holding the long hilt tightly with both hands, Ninkei sharply unsheathed it. Without looking back, he suddenly twisted his waist and abdomen, turned around, poured all his strength into the long knife, and chopped at the night sky with a momentum that could burn the sky. As if there were eyes on the back of his head, the fierce knife chopped accurately at the assassin in black who was falling rapidly. The sharp blade fiercely cut off the short knife in the assassin's hand. Then the long knife chopped into his neck without any hindrance. The blade did not stop until it went deep into his neck. The assassin in black did not even have time to groan. He jumped down from the treetops and fell on the dead leaves. His knees went weak and he knelt down. Ninkei stepped back and grasped the hilt of the previous assassin's chest. He pulled it out forcefully and walked back to the assassin. He chopped backhandedly, and the blade cut into the other side of the neck, meeting with the previous blade in the neck bone. Blood sprayed and the assassin's head fell with a click. It rolled over his knees, rolled over the fallen leaves, and rolled far away in the forest. In the war between the Tang Empire and the Yin Kingdom, the vanguard led by General Xiahou had assassinated countless Yin cavalry. Those mysterious assassination teams were made up of elite soldiers and had no cultivators. However, they had performed extremely valiantly on the battlefield, and had even succeeded in assassinating cultivators. Most people did not know the structure of the mysterious assassination group under General Xiahou's command, but Ninkei did. He knew that the assassin group under Xiahou's command usually worked in groups of 3. Therefore, from a very young age, he had always carried 3 knives on his back. Chapter 16. For Ninkei, who had been walking among herds of beasts in forests and grasslands since he was a child, he was not afraid of a killer who was good at assassination at night, but the mysterious cultivator. Therefore, after chopping off the assassin's head, He immediately rushed back to the slope where the fire was still burning. He quickly picked up the boxwood bow and arrow and aimed at the great sword master in the distance. This time his vigilance was somewhat superfluous. That middle-aged scholar in blue robes no longer made any movements. He only quietly leaned against a large tree. The pair of black eyes on his bloody face quietly looked at the youth in the firelight. He muttered a few words and then with a faint smile, he spread out his hands and died. Ning-Ke aimed at the body of the great sword master and kept silent for a long time until his arms began to tremble. He slowly put down the bow and arrow and suddenly felt fatigue and soreness invading his body. He did not look back and asked, "Are you all right?" The fire caused by the kerosene bomb ignited the fallen leaves, but the rotten mud at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road gradually extinguished the fire. The big black umbrella was closed again. Sang Sang half squatted on the ground and looked up at his back, shaking her head. It seemed that she knew that her young master could know what she had done without her saying anything. The maidservant knew that Ning-Ke was not concerned about her. She stood up, lifted the hem of her skirt, and quickly ran to the carriage that was about to become ruins. She crazily pushed aside the heavy wooden shards, and then hugged the little boy in her arms, her face full of tenderness as she gently wiped the dust off his face. About 6 or 7 grassland barbarians and Tang bodyguards were still alive. They struggled to get up and walked to the carriage ruins with difficulty. The heavily injured bodyguard leader led the others to kneel on one knee and said with his head touching the ground, "I didn't fight well and let the thief disturb Her Highness. I deserved to die 1,000 times." Under the illumination of the stars and the remaining sparks, the blood-soaked men knelt down to worship a maidservant holding a child. They were not sad but showed a sense of bravery or tragedy. Sang Sang walked to Ning-Ke's side and they quietly watched the scene. They had already guessed the true identity of the maidservant and did not bother to pretend to be shocked. After catching their breaths for a while, the guards and barbarians bandaged each other's wounds with difficulty and applied ointment. When their breathing had stabilized, they began to clean up the battlefield and carried back a few of their severely injured companions. At the same time, they killed all the enemies who were still breathing. After finishing these tasks, these fierce men subconsciously looked behind them. Looking at the lad in the slightly burnt cotton jacket, the bodyguards had a complicated expression in their eyes. They were shocked, confused, and even a little scared. They saw Ning-Ke's previous moves and knew that this lad was skilled in martial arts and excellent in archery. But he was not a hidden powerhouse beyond the imagination of the secular world. In this attack, it was the bodyguard and Liu Qingchun who had been fighting against the two most powerful cultivators on the enemy's side. It was them who had taken out most of the great sword master's life, which gave Ning-Ke the chance to kill him with 3 arrows. However, the more it was so, the more they felt that this lad was a very terrible person. The timing and angle of the attack were extremely precise and ruthless. The gentle and immature appearance of the lad hit a calm heart. Especially the last 3 knives that killed the 3 assassins in black, it was even more incredible. How could he do all this at such a young age? How many people had he killed and how many heads had he chopped off in the grassland border town? Leaning on a branch, the bodyguard walked to Ning-Ke and his handmaiden with difficulty. He cupped his hands and bowed deeply. He did not say a word of thanks, but the deepest gratitude from the bottom of his heart was reflected in this action. Ning-Ke held Song Song's hand and moved to the side, refusing to accept his salute. Just as the great sword master had said, the Tang bodyguards brought by Her Highness to the grassland had shown an iron-blooded demeanor and strict military discipline in battle, which deserved the respect of any enemy or friend. I can see that your martial arts are not conventional. If we were to fight barehanded, I don't think you'd be a match for me. But even I wouldn't be able to block the 3 assassins when they appeared, let alone kill them so cleanly. The bodyguard leader looked at Ning-Ke's immature face and suppressed the shock in his heart. He asked in a hoarse voice, "Lad, I'm very curious about your ability to kill. Where did you learn it?" Ning-Ke scratched his head and kept silent for a while. Then he said with a smile, "The ability to kill is naturally learned through killing." Of course, he could not tell the bodyguard leader that he had been preparing to be killed or killed by the enemy, since he knew the name Xiaoho when he was 4 years old. The valiant general of the Tang Empire had no idea that in a small town far away in the frontier fortress, there was a young man diligently practicing his saber and chopping firewood every day, analyzing the fighting styles of all the experts under his command, and coming up with countless countermeasures. So for Ning Kai, the 3 assassins in black who died under his knife today were just the inevitable result of his hard practice and cultivation for more than 10 years. If it were other enemies, such as the bodyguard leader in front of him, it would be difficult for him to achieve such a beautiful result. Today, in the Battle of Northern Mountain Road, Ning Kai finally met with the subordinates of General Xiaohou. Maybe it was just an accident, or maybe it was the arrangement of fate. Anyway, the knife and arrow of revenge finally began to show its coldness. The bodyguard leader touched his wounded chest and frowned at the lad who had a face full of indifference. He murmured, "You are only 15 or 16 years old. Have you killed more people than me?" "If you count the animals, I have killed a lot." Ning Kai answered with a smile. "I said you killed people." The bodyguard leader asked in a serious tone and then explained, "I'm not questioning you. I'm just really curious." Ning Kai rubbed his face and looked at him after a moment of silence. He said, "The biggest income in the border town is killing the horse gang. We usually call it firewood. In recent years, I have been leading the firewood collecting in the city of Wei. Speaking of killing, I have killed a lot of people these years." A grassland barbarian followed behind the bodyguard leader, and was about to express his gratitude to the young soldier. He had the same question in his mind. However, after hearing Ning Kai's answer, he turned around and left without saying a word. It could be seen that his footsteps were a little messy and his shoulders were slightly trembling. A grassland barbarian looked at him and asked in confusion, "Dumu, what's wrong with you?" The grassland barbarian named Dumu sat down beside the fire. He raised his wounded arm with difficulty and patted his face, which was numb because of fear. He said, "That lad should be the legendary woodcutter from Shubi Lake." As soon as he said this, the 4 grassland barbarians beside the fire changed their expressions at the same time and no longer spoke. Some of them secretly looked up at Ning Kai and then quickly lowered their heads, as if they were afraid that the lad would see them spying on them. These barbarians were famous horse gangs on the grassland before they were subdued by Her Highness. They were known for their extreme fierceness. But for them, the powerful border army of the Tang Empire was the real horse gang. The imperial cavalries in the frontier fortress cities would carry out a part-time money-making activity when the season changed and the logistics were not enough to rob the grassland horse gangs. The border army of the Tang Empire called this activity firewood collecting. The horse gangs called this bloody battle firewood chopping. They called the most ferocious leader of the Tang Empire the woodcutter. And the woodcutter of Shubi Lake was the most ferocious and horrible existence. He was the reason why Shubi Lake turned red, the nightmares of the grassland horse gangs, and the scary stories around the fire. But before tonight, they had never thought that the woodcutter could be so young. Chapter 17. After the bloody and tragic battle, the survivors looked at Ning Kai with subtle changes in their attitudes. During the journey after leaving the city of Wei, they respected Ning Kai's ability as a guide. When they encountered some big events or important decisions, Ning Kai was just a big stone in the eyes of the bodyguards. But now, no matter what they did, they would subconsciously ask for his opinion. After reporting to Her Highness, the bodyguard leader followed Ning Kai's opinion and did not immediately withdraw from the Northern Mountain Road. Instead, he decided that all the wounded would stay here and wait for further orders, hoping that the reinforcement troops at the southern foot of the Northern Mountain Road could arrive before dawn. The weak old man Liu Qingchen quietly looked at the lad beside the bonfire with a smile on his face. He gently rubbed his right thumb on the belly of his index finger, but in the end he just shook his head. 2 bonfires were lit beside the carriage. Although the forest was dense and windy, fortunately, there was night dew on the rotten leaves, so there was no need to worry about a troublesome fire. The bodyguard leader and the wounded gathered around one of the bonfires, leaving another one in a better position for Her Highness, the old man and the little boy. Even in such a difficult situation, they still did not forget the hierarchy. After being tied up, taking medicine and eating, the grassland barbarians could not resist the hunger and thirst after the battle and began to sip wine. The people around the bonfire passed the wine bags to Sang Sang, but the little handmaiden shook her head slightly. Then, the barbarian named Dumu walked to Ningke with a very respectful expression, and handed the wine bag to him with both hands. Looking at this scene, someone frowned slightly. She knew very well that these grassland barbarians, who were loyal to her, were arrogant and unruly horse bandits on the grassland before they were subdued. They rarely showed respect to others except for herself, not to mention that there was an obvious fear in their respect at this time. Even if the teenager played a decisive role in the previous battle and made them grateful, where did the fear come from? Ningke took the wine bag and drank a mouthful, frowning because of the strong alcohol. He looked at the old man by the fire, and his heart moved slightly. He used his hands to support his tired body and walked over. However, before he could bow, cup his hands, or even kneel down to ask for guidance like he had imagined when he was young, he was stopped by a faint voice. "Take a seat." Ningke turned his head to look at the maidservant beside the fire. He looked at her face that was illuminated by the fire and sighed softly in his heart. He bowed respectfully and then sat down not too far from her in a well-behaved manner, although he insisted that, contrary to what the world was saying, she was an idiot. But even if he was an idiot, the difference in status between them was like the stars in the sky and a loach in the paddy field, so he had to pay attention to his etiquette and be respectful. Because she was not a maidservant. She was the fourth princess of the Tang dynasty, Li Yu. Li Yu quietly looked at the young man's side profile. His youthful face looked very ordinary. Apart from the small dimples that occasionally appeared when he smiled and the freckles that were not ugly under the firelight, there was nothing special about him. However, the performance of such an ordinary young soldier in battle reminded her more than once of the indifferent tiger leaping over the bushes on the grassland. For some reason, she, who had just experienced a thrilling assassination, felt much more relaxed and calm as long as she looked at Ningke, who was not far away from her, even though she still had a lingering fear after experiencing a thrilling assassination. Perhaps it was because the young man was guarding her like a ferocious tiger. But the problem was that she did not like this young man. From the city of Wei to the way he disguised himself as a maidservant to the way he behaved, whether he was disguised as a maidservant or now as a princess, she disliked the behavior of this border town soldier. What made her even more unhappy was that she always felt that Ningke's respect for her was just for show, and she could not see any sincerity. She even always felt that he should be laughing at her in some dark corner. It had to be said that a woman's intuition was always a terrible weapon, whether it was a peasant woman in the village or a resentful woman in the palace. As the most distinguished princess of the Tang Empire, as long as she thought that a low-level soldier was mocking her, she should be angry. But now what the princess felt was that sitting next to him, sitting next to the fire, made her feel relaxed and safe. She felt protected. She liked this feeling, but she did not like that this feeling appeared because of Ning Quebec. Therefore, she felt inexplicably ashamed and annoyed. She slightly narrowed her eyes to look at his side profile, and deliberately spoke in a much colder tone. "When the enemy attacked just now, it seemed that you wanted to go into the horse carriage to save me? What palace was I? Daming Palace? Lixia Palace? Anyway, the real me was not in the horse carriage at that time. Now I say that you wanted to save me at that time. I am mocking you for only thinking about making a contribution. Actually, I knew that Her Highness was Her Highness when we were in the city of Wei." Ningke looked at her and explained seriously. Her Highness was Her Highness, and the me in the horse carriage was naturally not a princess. Small tricks that might be useful in alluring the enemy were, in fact, only low-level camouflage in the eyes of real smart people. Liu slightly frowned. He just rubbed Song Song's little head lovingly and pulled her into his arms. On the other side, the bodyguards had already fallen asleep. The night was deep and the birds were occasionally awakened by the stars and carelessly chirped. Ning Ke looked at the crystal color in her eyes in surprise. He followed her gaze and found that she was looking at a pile of bodyguards and grassland barbarians' bodies by the road. Thinking of her wiping the little boy's nose and seeing her sad feelings for her subordinates, Ning Ke's impression of the princess changed again. He silently thought that even if she was an idiot, she was still an idiot with humanity. Sang Sang fell asleep on his knees. Only he and Li Yu were still awake by the bonfire. The two of them sat quietly. Suddenly, the little brute boy struggled out of her arms. He rubbed his eyes and said that he couldn't sleep and wanted to listen to a story. Li Yu looked embarrassed. She thought that she had long forgotten the stories she had heard in the palace when she was young. How could she tell the novels about scholars and beautiful women that she loved to listen to when she was a young girl to a child? The little barbarian boy did not make a noise. He just looked at his nominal mother pitifully and unwillingly. Ning Ke looked at the embarrassed princess with a smile and gently coughed twice. The wheat was golden and the oats were green. The duck eggs cracked one by one, but the biggest egg didn't move at all. The mother duck looked at the big and ugly baby and watched it swimming happily in the water. She said proudly, "Look, it's not a hateful turkey, it's my baby. But it is too ugly. No matter where it goes, people will point at it." The wild duck said that as long as you don't marry the ducks of our tribe, it has nothing to do with us. One night, when the beautiful sun was setting in the west of the wilderness, the ugly duckling saw a flock of big birds flying out of the woods. The ugly duckling had never seen such beautiful things. They were white and shiny with long and soft necks. They spread their beautiful wings and flew to the warm country. After a winter, the ugly duckling was surrounded by several swans. It felt ashamed. It felt so ugly, but the swans gently pecked its feathers. It suddenly saw how beautiful it was in the pool. Spring came. The sun was very warm. The lilacs hung their branches in the water in front of the ugly duckling. People watched the ugly duckling dance and sing happily. They shouted happily, "Look at that beautiful swan." Ning Ke took a piece of charred wood and casually drew lines on the ground beside his feet. He lowered his head and told a very old story with a smile. The story was so simple but so sad and happy. The little barbarian boy lay on the princess's body and listened with wide eyes. Li Yu also gradually became absorbed in the story. Sang Sang woke up. She had heard the story when she was very young, but she still listened quietly with a childish smile on her face. The night grew darker.